It began beside a river that did not look dangerous until men tried to cross it under fire. Hotton lay along the Ourthe, a small Belgian town shaped by water, bridges, and roads that narrowed as they entered the valley. In quieter times, the river meant trade and routine. In winter, it meant cold and restraint. In December of 1944, it became a line that could decide whether an advance continued or failed. The land around Hotton rose and fell gently, but the approaches funneled movement in ways that punished speed and rewarded preparation. The Ardennes offensive was already in motion when Hotton came into focus. German columns were pushing west through snow and fog, chasing a timetable that left no room for hesitation. Armor needed intact bridges. Infantry needed routes that led somewhere. Fuel needed to keep flowing forward. Any interruption threatened the entire plan. Hotton sat directly astride one of those critical routes, and the river that ran through it offered both passage and denial. Winter tightened everything. Snow muted sound and hid danger. Ice glazed roads and bridges. Fog collapsed visibility to fragments. Movement slowed even before resistance appeared. Engines strained, tracks slipped, columns compressed. And then the fighting began. American forces moved quickly to defend Hotton, understanding what the terrain offered and what it demanded. Bridges were watched carefully. Defensive positions were established on high ground overlooking approaches. Artillery was brought forward to cover the roads that led into the valley. There was no time to build comfort. There was only time to prepare. German units approached with urgency sharpened by narrowing margins. They pressed toward the river, probing defenses, searching for intact crossings. Infantry advanced cautiously through fields and tree lines. Tanks moved forward along roads that offered little room to maneuver. The goal was simple and unforgiving. Cross the Ourthe and keep moving. Hotton refused to open easily. The first clashes were sharp and immediate. Gunfire cracked across the valley. Artillery shells burst along roads and slopes, throwing snow and earth into the air. Smoke drifted low, trapped by the cold. The sound of engines echoed between hills, magnified and distorted, making distance hard to judge. The bridges became focal points. Every approach drew fire. Every attempt to secure a crossing met resistance. Every minute lost tightened the pressure. American defenders fought from prepared positions, using elevation and cover to deny movement. Engineers worked under threat, reinforcing obstacles and preparing demolitions where necessary. Infantry held ground knowing that holding here meant far more than holding a town. German attacks intensified. They pushed harder, seeking to overwhelm defenses before they could fully harden. Infantry surged forward under covering fire. Armor edged closer to the river, searching for angles that might offer passage. Losses mounted. Vehicles burned near the water's edge. The river itself seemed to push back, cold and fast, turning failed attempts into wreckage. Time became the enemy. Fuel burned while engines idled. Columns backed up behind stalled lead elements. Routes that had seemed open on maps narrowed into choke points. The Ardennes offensive depended on momentum, and momentum was bleeding away here, minute by minute. American countermeasures tightened the grip. Artillery fire bracketed approaches. Defensive positions shifted as needed, denying predictable patterns. When weather allowed, the threat of air attack forced movement into concealment. The valley became a place where speed turned into exposure, and persistence turned into vulnerability. Hotton absorbed the violence unwillingly. Buildings shook. Streets filled with debris. Civilians sheltered wherever they could. As the town became a battlefield it never invited. Snow fell again, settling over wreckage and footprints alike, indifferent to plans and uniforms. Eventually, the balance shifted decisively. German forces could not secure the crossings quickly enough. Fuel shortages worsened. Pressure from Allied forces increased. The cost of continuing outweighed the chance of success. Units pulled back, leaving behind damaged equipment and abandoned routes that would not carry them forward. Hotton held. And because it held, something larger faltered. The delay at the Ourthe disrupted schedules that could not absorb disruption. It forced rerouting, congestion, and hesitation at exactly the wrong moment. The offensive did not fail at Hotton alone, but Hotton helped drain the speed it could never recover. The Battle of Hotton matters because it shows how terrain and timing can outweigh numbers. A river, a bridge, a valley that narrowed choices. It reminds us that in modern war, denial can be as powerful as advance, and that holding the right place at the right moment can reshape events far beyond a single town. Tonight, we return to that river crossing, to the roads that slowed into stillness, to the bridges that refused to carry steel west, to Hotton, where winter, water, and resolve pressed momentum into retreat. Before we continue, let me bring you into this moment as well. Where in the world are you listening from right now? And what time has settled around you there? Is it deep into the night, early morning, or somewhere quietly between? And one final invitation. Different from any you have heard before, if these calm, immersive journeys through overlooked battles help you unwind, focus, or feel grounded as the day finally loosens its grip, consider subscribing. Not for urgency, but for presence. So these stories are always here when you want history told slowly, carefully, and without rushing you along. The morning of December 15th, 1944, arrived in Hotton like any other winter day in occupied Belgium. Marie Bouillon stood in her kitchen, slicing bread for her 3 children, while American supply trucks rumbled past her window along the narrow cobblestone streets. The smell of wheat coffee filled the small house, mingling with the cold air that seeped through gaps in the wooden shutters. She had no way of knowing that within 96 hours, her home would cease to exist, buried under rubble and fire in a battle that history would largely forget. Hotton was nobody's idea of strategic terrain. This village of 1,200 souls sat nestled in a bend of the Ourthe River, surrounded by the dense forests of the Belgian Ardennes. Its buildings clustered around a 19th-century stone bridge, the kind of unremarkable crossing that appeared on every second river in Europe. American soldiers stationed here called it the Quiet Sector, a place where supply clerks caught their breath and replacement troops acclimated before moving to the real war further east. The 3rd Armored Division used the town as a logistics hub, nothing more. Trucks came and went. Locals traded eggs and milk for chocolate and cigarettes. The front lines lay 45 kilometers away, safely distant, or so everyone believed. But geography tells truths that men often miss until blood forces the lesson. Hotton controlled something far more valuable than its residents realized: access to the Meuse River crossings 20 kilometers to the west. The stone bridge over the Ourthe was the key to a natural bottleneck, where the river narrowed and the surrounding terrain funneled all traffic through a single corridor. The N4 highway, the main supply artery feeding the entire northern shoulder of the Ardennes front, ran straight through Hotton's center. On December 15th, this meant convenience for American logistics. Within a week, it would mean survival for an entire army. 12 kilometers northeast of Hotton, in a farmhouse converted to a German observation post, a reconnaissance team was photographing that very bridge. The images showed clear approaches from the east, the width sufficient for armor, the stone construction strong enough to support the heaviest tanks. These photographs would reach the desk of SS Oberstgruppenführer Sepp Dietrich within 36 hours. They would be studied by staff officers planning Operation Wacht am Rhein, Hitler's desperate gamble to split the Allied armies and capture Antwerp. On those maps, Hotton appeared as an afterthought, a secondary objective to be seized in passing during the triumphant drive to the coast. The German planners assigned it one paragraph in their operational orders. They would soon learn the cost of that assumption. At 18th Airborne Corps headquarters, 30 kilometers northwest in Werbemont, Major General Matthew Ridgway was studying his own maps that morning. His finger traced the road networks, calculating response times and reserve positions. He circled Hotton with a grease pencil, not because it seemed important, but because its position made it a useful reference point. Ridgway had built his reputation on anticipating disaster, on seeing what others missed. He had commanded paratroopers in Sicily and Normandy, places where plans dissolved into chaos and improvisation determined survival. Yet even Ridgway, scanning those maps on December 15th, did not see what was coming toward this quiet crossroads. The Americans in Hotton that day lived in a bubble of routine normality that exists in all wars between the storms of combat. Lieutenant James Holloway of the 3rd Armored Division Supply Company was processing requisition forms in a commandeered hotel. Sergeants were conducting vehicle maintenance in barns that smelled of hay and diesel. A few infantry replacements fresh from England wandered the streets, buying postcards to send home, writing about a charming little Belgian town where nothing ever happens. One of those soldiers, Private First Class Theodore Walensky, would be dead within 120 hours, the first American to fall in a battle that would consume over 1,000 lives. The civilian population went about their business with the practiced indifference of people who had survived 4 years of German occupation before the Americans arrived in September. Marie Bouillon's neighbor, Gabriel Misson, a former schoolteacher who worked with the Belgian resistance, had noticed increased German radio traffic in recent days. His underground contacts reported unusual activity near the border, but his warnings to American intelligence officers had been filed away as unconfirmed civilian reports. The Americans were planning their own offensive, preparing to drive into Germany after Christmas. They saw what they expected to see: an enemy exhausted, defeated, incapable of significant counteraction. Confidence is war's most expensive commodity. The weather on December 15th brought freezing fog that reduced visibility to 200 meters. This was normal for the Ardennes winter, the kind of weather that grounded aircraft and turned roads into treacherous ribbons of ice. For soldiers, it meant misery, damp cold that penetrated every layer of clothing, feet that never dried, hands that fumbled with equipment because gloves made everything impossible. For commanders, it meant tactical blindness. Reconnaissance patrols could see nothing. Air observation was impossible. Armies moved in their own private worlds, unable to perceive what lay beyond the next tree line. On this particular morning, that fog concealed the greatest concentration of German armor assembled since Kursk, poised 45 kilometers east, aimed directly at Hotton and beyond. Inside the stone bridge that would become the battle's focal point, water flowed steadily beneath the ice forming along the banks. The Ourthe here ran perhaps 30 meters wide, too deep to ford, too fast-flowing to freeze solid. Engineers had examined the bridge back in October, noting its construction: solid 19th-century masonry, built to last centuries, capable of supporting 40-ton loads without strain. They had marked it on their maps as tactically significant infrastructure and moved on. None of them imagined that within 9 days, men would be dying on that bridge, that it would become the hinge upon which the entire northern flank of the Battle of the Bulge would swing. As darkness fell on December 15th, Marie Bouillon served dinner to her family: potato soup, bread, a small portion of ham. Through her window, she could see American soldiers gathering in the square, smoking cigarettes, their laughter carrying on the cold air. German artillery was being moved into position 45 kilometers away, crews checking elevation tables and ammunition loads. SS Oberstgruppenführer Dietrich was reviewing final operational orders, his staff calculating fuel consumption rates and advanced timetables. Major General Ridgway was eating a late meal at his headquarters, unaware that his corps would soon be fighting for its survival. All the pieces were moving toward Hotton, drawn by geography and desperation, by the logic of war that transforms unremarkable places into names written in blood. The quiet crossroads had one more day of peace. After that, it would become something else entirely: a killing ground, a test of will, a battle that would determine whether the American line held or collapsed. And when it was over, when the bodies were buried and the rubble cleared, most of the world would never even learn its name. December the 16th, 1944. 05:30 hours. The darkness along the German border erupted with the sound of 2,000 artillery pieces firing simultaneously. The barrage walked across American positions in methodical fury, high explosive shells churning frozen earth into geysers of dirt and snow and shattered trees. This was Operation Wacht am Rhein, Hitler's last great offensive in the West. And at that moment, thousands of young Germans climbed from their assembly areas, believing the Führer's promise that they would be in Antwerp within 10 days. At the center of this maelstrom, commanding the 6th Panzer Army's northern thrust, SS Oberstgruppenführer Josef Sepp Dietrich felt something between exhilaration and dread. He had fought in both world wars, earned the Knight's Cross, commanded the Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler since its inception. But standing in his forward command post that morning, listening to the thunder of his own artillery, Dietrich knew what his staff officers did not yet dare to say. The plan was already in trouble. Dietrich's mission was brutally simple on paper. His 6th Panzer Army would punch through American lines north of the Schnee-Eifel, race westward through the broken terrain of the Ardennes, seize the bridges over the Meuse River, and drive on to Antwerp. Speed was everything. The entire operation depended on capturing fuel stocks from the Americans, because German logistics could not sustain a 120-kilometer advance. Dietrich had been allocated the best formations Germany could still field. The 1st SS Panzer Division, Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler, the 12th SS Panzer Division, Hitlerjugend, and supporting units that on paper comprised a fearsome striking force. His spearhead, Kampfgruppe Peiper, under SS Obersturmbannführer Joachim Peiper, consisted of 72 tanks, including the mighty Panther and Tiger models, backed by infantry mounted in half-tracks and supported by artillery and engineers. This was mobile warfare, as the Germans had perfected it in France in 1940 and Russia in 1941. But this was December 1944, and Germany was not the same force that had conquered Europe 3 years earlier. The first reports reaching Dietrich's headquarters on the morning of December 16th told a mixed story. The initial American defenses had collapsed under the weight of the assault, exactly as planned. Green American divisions, newly arrived in what they thought was a quiet sector, broke and fled. German infantry surged through gaps, capturing thousands of prisoners. But then came the problems, small at first, then cascading into crisis. The roads were worse than reconnaissance had suggested, narrow dirt tracks through dense forest, rather than the paved highways German doctrine required. Traffic jams developed immediately as armor units tried to squeeze through villages where 2 vehicles could barely pass side by side. Peiper's column, supposed to be racing westward at 30 kilometers per hour, was crawling at less than 5. Most critically, the American fuel dumps that German intelligence had promised did not exist or had been evacuated. By nightfall, the December 16th, Peiper's Panthers were burning fuel 3 times faster than the supply columns could deliver it. December the 17th brought the moment that would doom Dietrich's entire offensive. Kampfgruppe, Peiper had managed to break into open territory, bypassing American strongpoints, driving toward the Meuse with the kind of audacity that had made Peiper a legend on the Eastern Front. But at Stavelot, American engineers blew a bridge before Peiper could seize it. He found another crossing, pushed through, only to run into increasingly stiff resistance at Stoumont. By December 18th, Peiper's force was stalled, surrounded on 3 sides, and critically short of fuel. Dietrich had committed his best unit, his sharpest sword, and watched it blunted against unexpected American resilience. The timetable called for German armor to reach the Meuse by December 20th. Instead, Peiper was fighting for survival 15 kilometers from where he should have achieved breakthrough. The evening of December 19th, Dietrich gathered his staff for a crisis conference. The room smelled of cigarette smoke and wet wool, the walls covered with maps whose red arrows showed ambitious plans that reality was already mocking. Intelligence officers reported American reinforcements flowing into the sector, the vaunted 82nd Airborne Division arriving, the 3rd Armored Division committing its reserves. Dietrich's operations officer, a veteran colonel who had survived 3 years in Russia, laid out the brutal truth. The northern route was blocked. Peiper was trapped. The 12th SS Panzer Division behind him was stuck in massive traffic jams. The entire offensive in 6th Panzer Army's sector was grinding to a halt. Someone needed to say what everyone was thinking, and it was Dietrich himself who finally spoke the words. "We need another route, now." Fingers began tracing along maps, looking for alternatives. The terrain of the Ardennes allows few options for large-scale armor movement. Rivers run in deep valleys. Forests limit maneuver. Roads are scarce and narrow, but there, 25 kilometers south of Peiper's death trap, was a possible opening. The corridor through Manhay toward Hotton and beyond Hotton to Marche and the Meuse. It was not the primary route. It had not been scouted properly. Intelligence on American strength there was fragmentary at best, but it was open, or appeared to be, and Dietrich was desperate enough to grasp at apparent openings. He issued orders to the 2nd SS Panzer Division Das Reich, which had been held in reserve. Advance toward Mannheim and Hotton, seize the crossings, open a route to the Meuse. The orders were fragmentary, rushed, lacking the detailed planning that characterized German operations at their best. This was improvisation driven by crisis, the kind of decision that either wins campaigns or ends in catastrophe. The 2nd SS Panzer Division. Das Reich had its own complicated history. Formed in 1939, it had fought in France, Yugoslavia, and Russia. At Kursk in 1943, it had lost thousands of men in the greatest tank battle in history. It had been rebuilt, refitted, and committed to Normandy, where American fighter bombers had savaged it during the retreat from France. By December 1944, it was once again at something approaching full strength. 22,000 men, 112 tanks mixing Panthers and Panzer Mark IVs, self-propelled artillery, and mechanized infantry. On paper, a formidable force. In reality, a formation filled with young replacements who had never experienced mobile warfare, commanded by veterans who were exhausted from 5 years of war. They would be advancing toward Hotton without proper reconnaissance, without clear intelligence, without the fuel reserves doctrine demanded. They would be attacking on a secondary axis because the primary axis had failed, and they would be facing American forces who, even now, were racing toward the same crossroads. Sepp Dietrich, studying his maps on the night of December 19th, understood the arithmetic of his situation with brutal clarity. Operation Wacht am Rhein had been allocated fuel for approximately 500 kilometers of vehicle movement per division. His units had already consumed 300 kilometers worth of fuel, covering less than 40 kilometers of advance. The Luftwaffe had promised air superiority, but delivered nothing except excuses about weather and fuel shortages. American artillery was responding with a weight of fire that German intelligence had not predicted, suggested the Americans had repositioned far more guns than estimates indicated. The entire southern wing of the offensive under the 5th Panzer Army was making better progress, but Hitler's orders had placed the main effort with Dietrich's 6th Panzer Army, which was now demonstrably stalled. Hotton represented not an opportunity, but a last desperate attempt to salvage an operation that was failing just 4 days after it began. What Dietrich did not know, could not know, was that American commanders were reacting with a speed and decisiveness that shattered every German assumption about Allied capabilities. The Americans in late 1944 were not the green, uncertain force that had stumbled through North Africa in 1942. They had learned in the hedgerows of Normandy, adapted in the pursuit across France, developed a flexible command culture that emphasized initiative at every level. When German armor appeared where it was not supposed to be, American officers improvised. When positions were bypassed, they formed ad hoc task forces. When the situation was unclear, they erred on the side of aggressive action. Dietrich was counting on American rigidity, on doctrinal inflexibility, on the kind of centralized command structure that required permission from higher headquarters for every decision. He was about to discover that the American Army of December 1944 bore little resemblance to the force he thought he was fighting. The final irony of Dietrich's situation would not become clear until later. Hotton, the objective he was now desperately trying to seize as an afterthought, was actually more important than the northern routes he had originally prioritized. The village sat at the perfect position to unhinge the entire American defensive arrangement. If German armor secured Hotton and pushed through to Marche, they would cut behind the American forces defending against Piper, encircle multiple divisions, and open a genuine path to the Meuse. Hotton was the strategic key the German planning staff had never properly recognized. By the time Dietrich realized this, on the night of December 19th, the Americans were already racing to defend it. The battle would not be decided by who saw the opportunity first, but by who could concentrate forces faster in terrain that punished hesitation. Sepp Dietrich had been given an impossible mission, inadequate resources, and a timetable written by fantasists in Berlin who had not heard artillery fire in years. He had done what good commanders do, recognized failure, adapted, sought alternatives. But adaptation requires time, and time was the one resource Operation Wacht am Rhein could not afford. The race to Hotton was already underway, and the Germans, despite their head start, were losing. December 19th, 1944, 1400 hours. The radio crackled to life in the operations tent of the 18th Airborne Corps, with a transmission that would be remembered as either prescient or tragically ignored, depending on which participants you asked decades later. A reconnaissance patrol from the 82nd Airborne Division reported tracked vehicles moving northwest near Berazmanil, 18 kilometers from Hotton. The radio operator, a corporal from Ohio, who had been in Europe for 3 months, estimated company strength, possibly battalion. The transmission was logged, marked with the time and coordinates, and filed with a dozen other reports flooding headquarters that day. In the chaos of the first 72 hours of the German offensive, this single report competed with hundreds of others for attention from overwhelmed intelligence officers who were trying to map the location of an entire German army that had appeared seemingly from nowhere. The failure to recognize what was coming toward Hotton was not the result of a single mistake, but a cascade of small failures that compounded into strategic blindness. American intelligence in December 1944 operated under assumptions that, while reasonable given previous experience, proved catastrophically wrong in this specific situation. The ultra-decrypts, the broken German codes that had given the Allies such advantage throughout the war, had failed to detect Operation Wacht am Rhein because German planners had maintained strict radio silence. Human intelligence from resistance sources was fragmented and often dismissed because it contradicted what analysts believed possible. Aerial reconnaissance, the eyes of the army, was grounded by the same fog and snow that concealed German movements. The Americans were trying to see through multiple layers of blindness, each layer reinforcing the others. At the Signal Intelligence Center in Verviers, 30 kilometers northwest of Hotton, cryptologists were picking up German radio traffic with increasing frequency starting on December 18th. The Germans had maintained remarkable silence before the offensive began, but once combat started, tactical units needed to communicate. The intercepts were fragmentary, sometimes just a few words before transmissions ended, but patterns emerged. The word Hotton appeared in intercepts starting late on December 19th. The traffic analysis suggested large formations on the move, armor units based on the call signs and procedures, but translation took time. Prioritization was difficult when every sector was reporting contact. And the analysts at Verviers, brilliant though they were, lacked the context to understand that these particular intercepts indicated a major force moving toward what everyone still considered a secondary area. The afternoon of December 19th brought the first physical evidence that should have triggered alarm. A Belgian resistance courier, Gabriel Missen, the former schoolteacher from Hotton, arrived at an American checkpoint with a report from resistance observers near Soy. They had seen a massive column the previous night. Tanks, trucks, infantry marching in files along the road. Missen estimated it as a full division, though he acknowledged he was guessing at military strength based on what civilians had described. The American captain who debriefed him was polite, took notes, thanked him for the information. The report was forwarded up the chain with the notation, "Unconfirmed civilian source, possibly exaggerated." It reached Corps headquarters 6 hours later, one report among dozens, and was evaluated against the prevailing intelligence estimate, enemy capable of battalion-sized attacks, regiment at most, a division, unlikely. Civilians were not trained observers. They panicked, exaggerated, misidentified. The report was filed. By evening, December 19th, reconnaissance patrols from the 3rd Armored Division were making direct contact with German forces closer to Hotton than anyone at headquarters realized. A patrol led by Sergeant William Chambers engaged what he reported as multiple armored vehicles 6 kilometers east of Manhay, which placed German armor just 15 kilometers from Hotton. Chambers' patrol withdrew under fire, having definitely identified at least 2 tanks and possibly more. His after-action report reached his company commander, who forwarded it to battalion, who included it in the evening situation report, which was compiled with reports from 30 other units and summarized in a single paragraph for Corps headquarters. Light enemy armored activity reported in Manhay sector. Light. The word would haunt the intelligence officers later. What Chambers had seen was the advance guard of an entire panzer division. But in the chaos of dozens of engagements happening simultaneously, his contact was assessed as one more probe among many. The most damning failure came from aerial reconnaissance. On the afternoon of December 19th, a P-47 Thunderbolt pilot, Lieutenant James McClure, managed to take advantage of a brief break in the weather to fly a reconnaissance mission over the area east of Manhay. He photographed a German column that extended for kilometers, clearly showing tanks and vehicles in large numbers. It was exactly the kind of intelligence that could have provided warning, but McClure's aircraft developed mechanical trouble on the return flight, forcing him to divert to a different airfield. His film canisters were not developed until December 21st, 48 hours later, by which time the battle had already begun. The photographs, when finally analyzed, showed clearly what was coming. They arrived too late to matter. At 18th Airborne Corps headquarters, Major General Matthew Ridgway spent the evening of December 19th trying to make sense of incomplete information. He was a soldier's soldier, had commanded paratroopers in combat, understood that the map on the wall was always cleaner than the reality in the field. His staff presented the intelligence estimate. German forces were pushing in multiple directions, but main enemy effort appeared focused on Bastogne to the south and containing Pieper to the north. Secondary attacks were developing toward Marche, possibly toward Hotton, but estimated strength was not sufficient to represent a major threat. Ridgway studied the map with the instinct that had kept him alive through Sicily and Normandy. Something felt wrong about the assessment. But what? He ordered a task force assembled as a precaution, units that could move quickly to reinforce wherever needed. It was the right decision. But even Ridgway did not yet understand the magnitude of what was developing. The problem was not lack of information, but the cognitive challenge of assembling accurate pictures from contradictory fragments during crisis. The Americans had reports of German armor in multiple locations, sometimes separated by distances that suggested multiple different units, or suggested that reporting was confused. The scale of the German offensive was unprecedented for defensive operations in this sector. Every previous German counterattack since Normandy had been limited, poorly supplied, easily contained. The analysts were trying to fit new data into patterns established by recent experience. When a patrol reported a battalion of German armor, they assumed exaggeration because that was what usually happened. When radio intercepts suggested division-sized formations, they assumed either misinterpretation or that multiple small units were using higher-level call signs for deception. Every data point was filtered through assumptions built on months of German weakness and retreat. By midnight December 19th, the situation was clarifying in the worst possible way. Multiple reports now painted a consistent picture. A large German force, division strength or larger, was advancing toward Manhay and Hotton, but consistent clarity came too late. The Germans were 18 kilometers from Hotton. American forces in the town consisted of supply personnel, a few anti-aircraft crews, perhaps 200 men total, none organized for ground combat. The nearest American combat units were the scattered elements of the 3rd Armored Division, themselves engaged in multiple locations, and the 82nd Airborne Division, committed to blocking Pieper further north. Someone would have to assemble a force to defend Hotton, and that force would have to be created from whatever units could be spared, thrown together on hours' notice, and sent to defend a bridge that most American commanders had never heard of 3 days earlier. The intelligence failure at Hotton was not dramatic incompetence, but the grinding, mundane difficulty of seeing clearly in war. Good intelligence officers made reasonable assessments based on available information. That information was incomplete, delayed, sometimes contradictory. The assumptions underlying their analysis were rational, given recent experience. But war is the domain where reasonable assumptions kill people. The German force approaching Hotton was larger, moving faster, and more determined than American intelligence estimated. The time available to respond was shorter than anyone realized. And the consequences of miscalculation were measured in the lives of men who would be ordered to hold positions against overwhelming odds because of decisions made by officers working with incomplete maps in headquarters 30 kilometers away. The phantom contact was becoming all too real, and the Americans were about to discover that sometimes the worst intelligence failure is not missing the enemy entirely, but underestimating him by just enough to turn a manageable crisis into a desperate fight for survival. December 20th, 1944, 02:30 hours. Major Robert Lee Orr was not asleep when the call came because sleep had become impossible somewhere around 1943. He sat in a requisitioned farmhouse that served as 3rd Armored Division headquarters, drinking coffee that tasted like motor oil and trying to understand why his hands had started shaking 6 months ago and never stopped. Orr was 33 years old, a West Point graduate, class of 1934, who had spent 9 years preparing for war and peacetime, and the last 6 months learning that preparation meant nothing when artillery started falling. The knock on his door came with the particular urgency that meant something had gone catastrophically wrong somewhere. The operations officer did not waste time with pleasantries. "Bob, we need you to take whatever you can get rolling and get to Hotton, now. We've got what looks like a German division heading that way, and there's nobody there to stop them." The creation of Task Force Orr demonstrated both the flexibility and the desperation of American command culture in December 1944. The U.S. Army had discovered in North Africa and Normandy that rigid organizational structures fractured under the chaos of mobile warfare. Task forces, ad hoc combinations of armor, infantry, artillery, and support units under a single commander became the standard American response to crisis. They violated peacetime doctrine, which insisted on training units together for months to develop cohesion. They mixed equipment types in ways that created logistics nightmares. But they worked, or at least, they worked better than trying to commit whole divisions to multiple simultaneous emergencies. Orr would command a task force because he was available, because his superiors trusted him to improvise, and because there was literally nobody else to send. The assembly of Task Force Orr in the pre-dawn hours of December 20th was controlled chaos. Company A of the 33rd Armored Regiment received movement orders at 0300. Load ammunition, fuel vehicles, prepare to move in 2 hours. The company commander, Captain James Mitchell, started waking his tank crews, most of whom had been asleep for perhaps 3 hours after a day of maintenance and resupply. 17 Sherman M4A3 tanks, the standard American medium tank, began their engines in the dark. Each Sherman mounted a 75mm main gun, carried 47mm of frontal armor, weighed 33 tons, and was crewed by 5 men who had learned that their vehicle was outmatched by German armor, but compensated by being more numerous and more reliable. Mitchell's tanks were not the most powerful on the battlefield, but they would run when asked and shoot when needed, which was more than could be said for many of the German Panthers that looked impressive until their transmissions failed. To the tanks were added infantry, 11 M5 Stuart light tanks for reconnaissance, 7 M10 tank destroyers with their open-top turrets and 3-inch guns, and elements of the 391st Armored Field Artillery Battalion with their M7 Priest self-propelled howitzers. The whole assemblage totaled perhaps 500 men, many of whom were meeting for the first time in the dark that morning. Company B of the 36th Armored Infantry Regiment had trained with different tank units. The artillery had rarely worked with these specific armor formations. Radio frequencies had to be hastily coordinated. Recognition signals were established in 10-minute briefings. This was not how doctrine said combined arms task forces should be organized, but doctrine was written by people who had time to plan, or had 3 hours. The scene at the assembly area before dawn resembled organized chaos under strict deadlines. Tank crews loaded ammunition, sliding 75mm shells into racks, stacking belts of 30 caliber machine gun rounds, checking periscopes and radios and the 1,000 small things that determine whether a tank fought or died. Infantry squatted by their half-tracks, checking rifles and machine guns and trying to understand where they were going and why. Sergeants moved through the darkness, identifying the men they knew and learning the names of those they did not. One infantry sergeant, Michael Pina, a Mexican-American from Texas who had joined the Army in 1942 seeking citizenship and respect, found himself commanding a squad of strangers who would have to trust him when the shooting started because there was no time for anything else. Trust in war is a luxury. Usually you settle for obedience and hope competence follows. Major Orr conducted his briefing at 600 hours, gathering officers and senior NCOs in the farmhouse kitchen where maps were spread across a wooden table. His orders were brutally simple: proceed to Hotton, assume defensive positions, prevent German forces from seizing the bridge over the Ourthe River, intelligence estimate, possibly a regiment, maybe more, exact composition unknown. Friendly forces in Hotton, minimal, primarily supply and headquarters personnel. Expected resistance, unknown. Timeline, German forces possibly arriving within 12 to 24 hours. Questions? There were dozens, most of which Orr could not answer because nobody knew the answers. What routes were the Germans using? Unknown. Would air support be available? Weather dependent, unlikely. When would reinforcements arrive? As soon as possible, no time frame confirmed. The questions revealed the fundamental uncertainty of the mission, but uncertainty was now standard procedure. Orr simply told his officers what he had been told. Gentlemen, we're going to Hotton because somebody has to be there when the Germans arrive. Make sure your men understand that we hold until relieved, however long that takes. The column departed Manhay at 0800 hours, moving through freezing fog that reduced visibility to 50 meters. The Shermans led, their tracks clanking on the icy roads, followed by half-tracks carrying infantry, then the tank destroyers and artillery. The column stretched for nearly 3 kilometers, moving at 15 kilometers per hour, vulnerable to ambush, but blessed by weather that prevented German air observation. Inside the Sherman tanks, commanders stood in their turrets despite the cold, because buttoning up meant blindness. In the half-tracks, infantry huddled against the cold, weapons across their knees, smoking cigarettes and trying to ignore the certainty that they were moving towards something bad. Nobody knew exactly how bad. Task Force Orr arrived in Hotton at 11:30 hours, December 20th, finding a village that was still largely intact, and civilians who were confused about why American tanks were suddenly positioning themselves around the town square. Orr established his command post in a stone building near the bridge, sent reconnaissance elements east toward Manhay, and began the task of organizing a defense with no time for proper preparation. Tank positions had to be selected on the spot. Infantry had to dig hasty fighting positions in frozen ground. Fields of fire had to be cleared. The stone bridge, the reason for the entire operation, sat exposed in the town center. A 19th century structure that became the focal point of American defensive planning. Orr studied it with the eye of an engineer, noting the solid construction, the clear approaches from the east, the lack of good cover for defenders. He ordered his company commanders to position anti-tank weapons covering every approach, established artillery observation posts on the high ground north of town, and tried to radio Corps headquarters for updates on German locations. The radio reports were not encouraging. Heavy contact developing east of Manhay. German armor confirmed, strength still being assessed. By mid-afternoon, Task Force Orr was as ready as improvisation allowed. 17 Sherman tanks occupied hold-down positions where they could cover approaches with direct fire. Infantry occupied buildings and hastily dug trenches at key intersections. Machine gun teams set up positions with overlapping fields of fire. Artillery forward observers identified registration points, pre-planned concentrations where fire could be brought down quickly. The Belgian civilians, finally understanding that a battle was coming, began evacuating or taking shelter in cellars. Marie Bouillon, the housewife who had served breakfast to her children 4 days earlier in a peaceful world, now gathered her family in the basement of her home, bringing food and water and blankets, settling in for what she prayed would be a temporary inconvenience. She did not know that she would spend the next 5 days underground, listening to the sounds of war destroying everything above her head. The final element of Task Force Orr's preparation involved a decision that would define the entire battle. Combat engineers had arrived in Hotton on December 19th and wired the stone bridge with 900 kilograms of TNT, standard procedure for infrastructure that might fall to the enemy. Demolition charges sat in place, waiting for the order to detonate. Orr inspected the setup that afternoon and faced the tactical dilemma that confronted every defensive commander: blow the bridge and deny it to the enemy, ensuring they could not use it, but also admitting you could not hold the town, or keep it intact and fight for it, risking that it might fall into German hands. The engineers recommended destruction if German armor appeared, or overruled them. "We're not blowing the bridge," he told his staff. "If we blow it, we're saying we can't hold the town. And if we can't hold the town, why are we here?" It was the kind of decision that looks either brilliant or disastrous depending on outcomes. The bridge would stand, and Task Force Orr would fight for it. And the next 4 days would determine whether Orr's confidence was justified or had condemned his men to death in a battle they could not win. The sun set on December 20th, with American forces positioned, waiting, knowing the Germans were coming, but not knowing when or in what strength, or whether the improvised force thrown together in darkness could hold against whatever was approaching through the winter fog. December 20th, 1944, 15:20 hours. Private First Class. James Kowalski was 19 years old, from Pennsylvania coal country, and he had been in Europe for exactly 43 days when he saw his first German tank. He was manning an observation post on the eastern edge of Hotton, positioned in the attic of a farmhouse with a radio and binoculars, ordered to report anything that moved on the Marche Road. For 2 hours, he had seen nothing but fog and bare trees, and the kind of empty landscape that makes young soldiers drowsy despite their fear. Then the fog shifted, and there it was. Dust rising in the distance, the unmistakable sound of diesel engines and movement that resolved into vehicles approaching in column. Kowalski grabbed his radio handset with shaking hands and transmitted the words that would begin the Battle of Hotton. Contact, multiple vehicles, estimate battalion strength, range 800 meters and closing. The first engagement lasted 90 seconds and taught both sides lessons about the terrain they would fight over for the next 5 days. The lead German vehicle, a Panther tank from the 116th Panzer Division, rounded a bend in the road and immediately came under fire from an M10 tank destroyer positioned in a concealed position behind a stone wall. The American 3-inch gun fired at 700 meters, the armor-piercing round striking the Panther's frontal armor at an oblique angle. The German tank shuddered under the impact, but did not penetrate. Its turret traversed with mechanical precision. The long 75mm gun elevated slightly and fired a single shot that hit the M10's open turret with catastrophic results. The American vehicle exploded, ammunition cooking off in a pillar of flame and black smoke. The crew of 5 men died instantly, their names added to casualty lists, before most of Task Force Orr even knew the battle had started. The Panther continued forward, unharmed, announcing to everyone within sight that German armor was here and American weapons were not guaranteed to stop it. But the terrain that favored the Germans on open roads worked against them in Hotton's narrow streets and close hedgerows. The Panther advanced cautiously after its initial success, its commander unwilling to push blindly into what might be an ambush. German doctrine emphasized reconnaissance before commitment, fire and maneuver, combined arms integration. This doctrine had been developed on the Eastern Front's vast spaces and refined in North Africa's deserts. It worked poorly in Belgian villages where streets were barely wide enough for a single tank, and buildings channeled movement into predictable lanes. The Panther advanced another 100 meters and stopped, waiting for infantry support, while American defenders used the pause to reposition and prepare. War is often decided not by the dramatic moments of contact, but by the small decisions made immediately after, and in those first minutes, the Americans were learning faster than the Germans expected. The afternoon of December 20th became a series of small, vicious engagements as German forces probed American positions seeking weakness. Infantry infiltrated through woods on the northern approaches, moving in small teams, trained professionals who used terrain and fire discipline to close with American positions. They ran into Company B, 36th Armored Infantry, dug into hasty fighting positions with machine guns and rifles, and the woods erupted with the distinctive sound of American Browning automatic rifles firing in short, controlled bursts. The Germans took casualties, withdrew, regrouped, tried different approaches. By 1600 hours, they had identified American positions on 3 sides of Hotton, but had not achieved breakthrough anywhere. The defensive perimeter was holding, but everyone understood this was reconnaissance, not the main attack. Nightfall on December 20th brought German artillery. The first rounds arrived at 1730 hours, 81mm mortar fire, walking across Hotton's main street in methodical progressions that showed experienced forward observers directing fire. Buildings exploded into rubble, roof tiles shattered into shrapnel. The stone bridge, surprisingly, was not targeted, suggesting German commanders wanted to capture it intact. American forces huddled in cellars and behind thick walls, learning the helplessness of being under bombardment with no ability to strike back. The barrage lasted 10 minutes, long enough to destroy a dozen buildings and kill 4 American soldiers who were caught in the open during a resupply movement. Then silence, more unnerving than the explosions, because silence meant infantry assault was coming. The first German infantry attack developed at 1840 hours from the northeast. Approximately 200 men advancing in coordinated rushes, covered by machine gun fire from positions in the tree line. They hit Company B's defensive line at the town's edge. And for 15 minutes, the night was illuminated by muzzle flashes and tracers. German MG-42 machine guns fired at their characteristic rate of 1,200 rounds per minute, a sound like ripping canvas that terrified everyone who heard it. American defenders returned fire with their own .30 caliber Browning M19-19s, slower but more controllable, and with M1 Garand rifles that gave individual soldiers firepower German infantry could not match. The Germans came within 50 meters of American positions before the assault stalled, pinned down by concentrated defensive fire. They withdrew at 1915 hours, leaving bodies in the snow that would freeze solid by morning. December 21st began at 0615 hours with another German artillery barrage, heavier this time, suggesting the commitment of additional guns. High explosive shells demolished buildings that had survived the previous evening. A direct hit on an American aid station killed 2 medics and 5 wounded soldiers. The stone bridge remained untouched, standing intact while the town around it was systematically destroyed. Major Ourthe, observing from his command post, understood the message. The Germans wanted the bridge functional, which meant they still believed they could capture it, which meant the real attack was still coming. He used the radio to call for artillery support from divisional guns, but weather-limited observation and most missions were fired blind, batteries shooting at map coordinates with uncertain results. The daylight hours of December 21st brought the grinding attritional combat that characterized the entire Battle of Hotton. German forces did not launch one massive assault, but instead applied constant pressure from multiple directions, probing for weak points, forcing American defenders to spread their limited forces along an extended perimeter. At 1100 hours, German tanks supported by infantry tried to force their way down the main road into town. 3 Shermans from Company A engaged them at ranges under 200 meters, street fighting where the first shot often decided survival. 1 Sherman was destroyed by a Panther's flanking shot. The German tank withdrew after taking multiple hits that damaged its track. At 1330 hours, German infantry infiltrated through gardens on the southern edge of town, getting within throwing range of American positions before being detected and driven back with grenades and submachine gun fire. By afternoon, December 21st, both sides were learning the tactical realities that would define the battle. The Germans had superior tanks but limited maneuver space. American defenders had excellent defensive positions but were outnumbered and outgunned. German artillery could level buildings but could not dislodge defenders from cellars and rubble. American artillery was available but often could not see targets through fog and smoke. Infantry on both sides discovered that close-quarters combat in villages favored the defense, that grenades were more useful than rifles, that buildings became death traps when hit by tank fire, but provided essential cover from small arms. These lessons were written in casualties. By nightfall, December 21st, Task Force Ourthe had lost approximately 40 men killed and another 60 wounded. German casualties were estimated higher, perhaps over 100, but the Germans had more men to spend. The most significant engagement of December 21st came at 14:30 hours when German forces made their first serious attempt to seize the bridge. A platoon of Panzer Grenadiers mounted on SDKFZ 251 half-tracks rushed the bridge approach from the east, attempting to overwhelm defenders through speed and shock. They made it to within 80 meters before American tank fire destroyed the lead half-track, blocking the narrow street. Infantry dismounted under fire, attempting to advance through the killing zone, and were caught by machine gun fire from multiple directions. The assault collapsed in less than 3 minutes, leaving 17 German dead in the street and the half-tracks burning. The Germans withdrew, and Ourthe, watching from his command post, understood that he had just won a tactical victory, but that the strategic situation remained desperate. The Germans would try again, with more force, better coordination, and eventually they would find a way through or around the defenses unless reinforcements arrived. The question was not whether Task Force Ourthe could hold indefinitely, because they could not. The question was whether they could hold long enough for reinforcements to matter. And nobody knew the answer, because nobody knew when reinforcements would arrive, or if they would arrive at all. The evening of December 21st brought reports that German forces were massing east of Hotton in preparation for a major assault. Reconnaissance patrols reported sounds of tracked vehicles, the distinctive rumble of tank engines idling, the movement of large numbers of infantry. American artillery fired harassing missions throughout the night, shells landing on suspected assembly areas with unknown effect. Inside Hotton, defenders prepared for what everyone understood would be the critical test. Ammunition was redistributed, wounded were evacuated to the aid station, soldiers ate cold rations and wrote letters they hoped would be mailed if they survived. Marie Bouillon, in her basement shelter, listened to the sounds of preparation and prayed for deliverance that seemed increasingly unlikely. The first blood had been drawn, the initial clashes had revealed the balance of forces, and now both sides prepared for the battle that would determine whether Hotton fell or held. The Americans had survived the first contact, but survival was not victory, and the longest night was still ahead. December 21st, 1944, 0900 hours. Captain John Thomas Granville stood on the stone bridge over the Ourthe River and tried to calculate the mathematics of destruction. He was 31 years old, a civil engineer from Massachusetts before the war, now commander of a company from the 291st Engineer Combat Battalion, and the 900 kilograms of TNT wired beneath this bridge represented both his professional expertise and his immediate moral dilemma. The charges were positioned perfectly. 3 on the main support pillars, 2 on the abutments, all connected to a detonator wire that ran 150 meters to a covered position, where one man with a twist of a handle could drop the entire structure into the river. Granville had supervised the placement himself 2 days earlier, following doctrine that required preparation of demolitions at all critical infrastructure in threatened sectors. Now, Major Ourthe was telling him the bridge would not be blown, and Granville was trying to understand whether that decision was tactical brilliance or fatal mistake. The stone bridge was unremarkable in most ways. 19th century construction, 42 meters long, 7 meters wide, built to carry farm wagons and local traffic across a river that was neither particularly wide nor strategically significant, until war transformed ordinary geography into contested ground. But this bridge had qualities that made it invaluable to both sides. It was the only crossing for 15 kilometers in either direction, capable of supporting armor. The Ourthe here ran in a narrow gorge with steep banks that channeled all vehicle traffic through this single point. North of Hotton, the river could be forded in places. South of Hotton, it widened and deepened. This bridge was the keystone, and both American and German commanders understood that whoever controlled it controlled the corridor to Marche and beyond, to the Meuse River crossings that were the ultimate objective of the German offensive. The decision not to demolish the bridge reflected Major Ourthe's assessment of psychological factors as much as tactical considerations. If the Americans destroyed the bridge, they implicitly admitted they could not hold Hotton. That admission would demoralize the defenders, signal to German commanders that aggressive action would achieve success, and potentially trigger a cascade of withdrawals as adjacent American units adjusted to the loss of this position. Conversely, Fighting for an intact bridge committed Task Force Ourthe to holding the town regardless of casualties, eliminated the fallback option, and created the kind of desperate defensive situation where men either succeeded or died trying. Ourthe was gambling that his soldiers would fight harder for a position they could not afford to lose than for one they had already written off. It was the kind of calculation that looked either inspired or insane, depending on whether you were making it from a warm headquarters or from a foxhole under artillery fire. The Belgian civilians trapped in Hotton added another dimension to the bridge decision. By December 21st, approximately 400 residents remained in the town, most sheltering in cellars, unable or unwilling to evacuate through the deteriorating tactical situation. Marie Bouillon confronted an American officer that morning, emerging from her basement shelter with fury overriding fear, demanding to know why the soldiers were preparing to destroy the bridge. "My sister is on the other side with her children," she said, her French rapid and angry. "You cannot trap us here. You cannot blow this bridge." The officer, a lieutenant from Ohio, who spoke no French, nodded and promised nothing, because he had no authority to promise anything. But the encounter highlighted the reality that modern war likes to obscure. Military decisions affect civilians who have no voice in those decisions, and sometimes the tactically sound choice is morally complicated in ways that doctrine does not address. The morning of December 21st brought the first indication that German commanders understood the bridge's importance and were deliberately avoiding its destruction. Artillery fire that demolished buildings throughout Hotton systematically avoided the bridge itself. German tanks that engaged American positions from long range did not fire on the structure, even when American defenders used it for cover. The message was clear. The Germans wanted the bridge intact because they intended to use it. This created a perverse situation where both sides agreed the bridge should not be destroyed, but for opposite reasons. The Americans needed to hold it as proof they could defend the town. The Germans needed to capture it as proof they could continue their advance. The stone span became a symbol more than infrastructure. And men would die for symbols because symbols are what give meaning to sacrifice. Captain Granville's engineers maintained the demolition charges throughout December 21st, checking connections and preparing for the order to detonate that everyone hoped would not come. The engineers were combat troops, trained to build and destroy under fire, but they were also technical specialists who understood structures and explosives with professional precision. Granville walked his men through the demolition plan repeatedly. If the order came, they had 60 seconds to reach the detonator, 30 seconds to confirm the circuit, and then immediate execution. No delays, no second guessing. Because German tanks could cross 42 meters of bridge faster than nervous soldiers could make decisions. The engineers nodded and hoped they would never have to prove their competence, but they were ready if orders changed. The afternoon assault on December 21st that saw German half-tracks attempt to rush the bridge demonstrated why Ourthe's decision to preserve it was militarily sound even as it was tactically risky. The bridge's approaches were narrow, channeled by buildings on both sides, creating a kill zone that American defenders could saturate with fire. The Germans came fast, hoping speed would overcome firepower, and died in the attempt, because confined terrain favored prepared defenses. If the bridge had already been destroyed, German commanders would have sought alternate crossings, dispersed their forces, complicated the American defensive problem by keeping the bridge intact, or forced the Germans to attack where he was strongest, turned their objective into a trap, and transformed defensive necessity into tactical advantage. It was the kind of operational art that staff colleges would later teach as an example of terrain exploitation, though the soldiers dying in the street that afternoon were less concerned with theoretical principles than with surviving the next 5 minutes. The civilians sheltering in Hotton's cellars experienced the battle primarily through sound. Marie Bouillon and her children sat in darkness, while above them the world tore itself apart with explosions and gunfire. They could not see the tactical situation, did not understand why Americans were fighting here, or why Germans wanted this particular town. Knew only that their home was being destroyed by forces they could not control or comprehend. When the German assault on the bridge failed at 14:30 hours, the civilians heard the sudden silence that followed intense combat, the kind of quiet that is somehow louder than noise, because it means the killing has temporarily stopped. Marie's youngest daughter asked when they could go upstairs, and Marie told her soon, knowing it was a lie but unable to offer truth that would only terrify a child more than the child was already terrified. By evening December 21st, the bridge had survived its first full day of combat and stood as testament to both its construction and the decisions made around it. German commanders, receiving reports that the bridge was defended and repeated assaults had failed to capture it, faced their own decision: continue attacking toward Hotton or seek alternative routes that avoided American strongpoints. The attack on Hotton was consuming forces needed elsewhere, producing casualties without territorial gain, and delaying the advance toward the Meuse that was the operation's ultimate objective. Tactical logic suggested bypassing Hotton, but operational reality made that difficult. The roads suitable for armor were few. The weather precluded off-road movement, and if German forces bypassed Hotton, they left an American position on their flank that could threaten supply lines and communications. The bridge that refused to fall became an operational problem that German commanders could not ignore and could not quickly solve. The American defenders, consolidating positions after surviving the day's attacks, understood that they had achieved something unexpected. Task Force Ourthe, an improvised formation thrown together in darkness and committed without proper preparation, had held against a German division for 24 hours. They had taken casualties, lost positions on the town's edges, seen the town itself reduced to rubble. But they had held the bridge, maintained the defensive core, and forced the Germans to recognize that Hotton would not fall easily. Major Ourthe, touring positions that evening and talking with squad leaders and tank commanders, saw exhaustion and determination in equal measure. These were not elite troops. Most had been in combat for months and were tired before this battle started. But they were holding because they believed their commander expected them to hold, because they trusted each other more than they feared the enemy, and because the bridge standing behind them was proof that their stand mattered. The stone span would survive the war, would carry traffic for decades after the last veteran died, would stand as the most enduring physical reminder of a battle most of the world would forget. But on the evening of December 21st, 1944, it was simply a bridge that had to be defended because orders said so, and because sometimes in war, that is reason enough to risk everything. December 21st, 1944, 1800 hours. Major Friedrich Holtmeier received the radio transmission he had been dreading since the offensive began. Hotton must fall tonight. No excuses. Commit all available forces. Report success by 0600 hours. He was 37 years old, a professional soldier who had joined the Wehrmacht in 1934, seeking career advancement in the expanding military. And he had seen enough war in the past 5 years to understand that orders demanding guaranteed success usually meant someone higher up was panicking. Holtmeier commanded Panzergrenadier Regiment 60 of the 116th Panzer Division, approximately 2,000 men when at full strength, currently closer to 1,500 after 5 days of offensive operations. He had trained his men, knew their capabilities, and understood that taking a defended town tonight, with exhausted troops against an enemy who had proven surprisingly resilient, was the kind of mission that produced casualty lists without corresponding gains. Holtmeier had survived 4 years on the Eastern Front, a distinction that, in late 1944, marked an officer as either exceptionally competent or extraordinarily lucky. He had fought in the advance to Moscow, participated in the Kursk offensive where his battalion had been decimated, retreated through Ukraine with Army Group South, and been transferred west to the 116th Panzer Division when the division was rebuilt in late 1944. He brought with him the lessons of the Eastern Front, that infantry tactics had to be aggressive but not reckless, that combined arms coordination determined success more than individual courage, that Soviet defenders who fought desperately could stop German attacks that should have succeeded on paper. Now he was facing American defenders in Belgian terrain, and he was discovering that the lessons from Russia applied equally in the Ardennes, even though the enemies were different. The planning session at Holtmeier's forward command post illustrated the challenges facing German forces on the evening of December 21st. His company commanders gathered in a damaged farmhouse, spreading maps on a table and arguing about approaches. The frontal assault that afternoon had failed with heavy casualties. American defensive positions were well sighted, covering all obvious approaches with interlocking fires. German artillery support was limited by ammunition shortages and poor communications with the guns positioned 8 kilometers behind the front. The Panther tanks that should have provided overwhelming firepower were hesitant to enter narrow streets where American bazookas could engage from close range. One company commander, a captain who had earned the Iron Cross at Kharkov, proposed a night infiltration, small teams moving through gardens and buildings, bypassing American strongpoints, seizing the bridge through surprise rather than the force. Another officer argued for waiting until morning when artillery could properly prepare the objective. Holtmeyer listened to both proposals and chose a middle course that satisfied neither, a limited night attack with 1 battalion while maintaining pressure on other sectors to prevent American reinforcement of threatened areas. The decision reflected the doctrinal flexibility that characterized German tactical leadership, even as strategic decisions were increasingly divorced from battlefield reality. German junior officers and NCOs were trained to operate independently, to assess situations and adapt plans based on immediate circumstances. This decentralized command culture had produced remarkable tactical successes early in the war, when German forces repeatedly outmaneuvered more numerous but less flexible opponents. But by December 1944, tactical flexibility could not compensate for strategic exhaustion. The 116th Panzer Division was short of everything except orders. Fuel consumption was exceeding supply by 30%. Ammunition expenditure in 5 days of combat had exhausted basic loads, and the division's tank strength had declined from 112 operational vehicles on December 16th to perhaps 70 by December 21st. Holtmeyer was being ordered to achieve breakthrough with forces that were already overextended. The German night attack on December 21st began at 2100 hours with infiltration teams moving through Hotton's eastern approaches. These were veterans, men who had survived years of combat by being smart and cautious, and they moved with the kind of professional competence that made them extraordinarily dangerous. They used the rubble for cover, advanced in short rushes coordinated by hand signals, avoided silhouetting themselves against fires still burning from the afternoon's artillery. They got within 20 meters of American command post before being detected by the sound of equipment rattling against a stone wall. The firefight that erupted was close and vicious, grenades exploding in confined spaces, submachine guns firing at ranges where missing was difficult, men killing each other at distances where they could see each other's faces. The German team withdrew after 5 minutes, having achieved nothing except confirming that American defenses extended throughout the town, not just at the perimeter. The armored component of Holtmeyer's attack came at 22:45 hours, when a Panther tank, number 321, according to its tactical markings, attempted to force its way into Hotton's town square. The tank commander was either extremely brave or following orders he could not refuse, because advancing a lone tank into a defended urban area at night was tactically suicidal. The Panther made it approximately 60 meters into the square before American defenders hit it with 6 bazooka rounds in rapid succession. The 2.36-inch rockets, fired from ranges under 30 meters, struck the tank's side armor where protection was thinner than the frontal glacis. None achieved clean penetration, but the cumulative effect damaged the track and started a small fire in the engine compartment. The Panther reversed, trailing smoke, and withdrew from the square. It would be repaired and returned to combat 2 days later. But on this night, it represented another German failure to achieve breakthrough through armored shock. By midnight, December 21st, Holtmeyer was forced to report to division headquarters that the attack had failed to achieve objectives. The radio conversation was professional but tense, division staff officers demanding explanations, and Holtmeyer providing assessments that nobody wanted to hear. American resistance was organized and determined, defensive positions were well prepared, German forces were exhausted and needed rest and resupply before mounting another major assault. The division operations officer responded with the inflexibility that characterized German command culture when strategic desperation overrode tactical reality. The attack must succeed. Use whatever force necessary. Hotton must fall before dawn. Holtmeyer acknowledged the orders and privately calculated how many of his men would die attempting the impossible. The German situation on December 21st illustrated the cascading failures that doomed Operation Wacht am Rhein even as combat continued. The offensive had been planned based on assumptions about American response times, fuel availability, weather conditions, and a dozen other factors that reality had disproven. When assumptions failed, the plan should have been modified or abandoned. Instead, German high command doubled down, ordering continued attacks because admitting failure was unthinkable to a regime that had built its identity around Marshall's superiority. Holtmeier and thousands of officers like him were caught between impossible orders from above and deteriorating capabilities below, expected to achieve breakthrough through will when materiel was exhausted. This was not a recipe for victory, but for the kind of grinding attrition that would characterize the final months of Germany's war. The soldiers in Holtmeier's regiment, waiting in the cold for orders to attack again, understood the situation with the clarity that comes from proximity to death. They were professionals, most of them, men who had joined the Wehrmacht before the war or early in the conflict when Germany was winning. They had survived campaigns that killed most of their original comrades. They knew how to fight, knew their weapons and tactics, knew their officers and trusted them to the extent that trust was possible in an army serving a regime increasingly detached from reality. But they also knew, with the kind of knowledge that cannot be spoken aloud, that Germany was losing. The Ardennes offensive might achieve local success, might capture towns and bridges and delay Allied advance. But it would not win the war, and everyone who thought honestly about the strategic situation understood that they were fighting now for survival, not victory. The final irony of Kampfgruppe Holtmeier's situation was that the unit's competence made failure more frustrating. These were not the poorly trained Volksgrenadier divisions thrown together in the war's last years, not the teenage soldiers of the Hitlerjugend divisions filled with fanaticism but lacking experience. The 116th Panzer Division was a veteran formation with professional officers and experienced NCOs, equipped with some of Germany's best remaining armor and supported by organic artillery and engineers. On paper, it should have rolled through an American task force assembled in hours from mismatched units. But war is not fought on paper, and the Americans defending Hotton were proving that improvisation backed by firepower could defeat doctrine when terrain limited maneuver. Holtmeier's frustration, evident in his reports and later in his letters, was the frustration of a competent professional facing an opponent who refused to follow the script. The Americans were supposed to break under pressure. Instead, they were holding, and every hour they held meant another hour that German forces bled strength they could not replace. The night attack would continue because orders demanded it, but Major Holtmeier, planning in his command post, while his men shivered in foxholes, already knew how it would end. More casualties, minimal gains, and another report to division headquarters explaining why victory remained just out of reach. December the 21st into 22nd, 1944, 23:30 hours. The darkness over Hotton was not merely the absence of light, but something active and malevolent, a physical presence that reduced existence to sound and fear and the animal instinct to survive until dawn. Sergeant Michael Pina crouched in a cellar that had been a wine storage room before the war, his .30 caliber carbine across his knees, listening to footsteps above him that might be his own men or might be Germans who had infiltrated American positions. The distinction mattered immensely, but darkness eliminated the visual cues that normally separated friend from enemy. Uniforms looked identical in shadow. Equipment silhouettes were ambiguous at best. The challenge and password system worked when people were calm and could speak clearly. But in the chaos of close-quarters combat, hesitation killed as surely as misidentification, and Pina was trying to calculate how long to wait before firing at sounds that might be soldiers he commanded. Night combat in December 1944 violated all the tactical principles that doctrine taught about maintaining unit cohesion and command control. Visibility without artificial light was measured in meters, sometimes in feet. Radio communication broke down because frequencies were jammed with urgent transmissions, and nobody could see to confirm what they were reporting. Units lost contact with adjacent formations, creating gaps that neither side could effectively exploit because neither side could see the gaps. Infantry movement became a matter of touch and sound, following walls with one hand, stopping every few meters to listen, moving in shuffling steps to avoid tripping on rubble. Combat when it erupted was sudden and chaotic, muzzle flashes revealing targets for a second, before darkness swallowed everything again, grenades exploding with light that was blinding rather than illuminating, men shooting at sounds and hoping they were shooting at enemies. The German infiltration team that reached within 20 meters of Major Ohr's command post represented the peak of professional infantry skills applied under nearly impossible conditions. These men had moved through 200 meters of American-occupied territory in complete darkness, bypassing fighting positions they could not see but could sense through sound and instinct. They carried satchel charges designed to demolish the command post and capture or kill Ohr, decapitating American command in a single stroke. They got close enough to hear American voices through the building's walls before someone dropped a metal canteen that rattled against stone with a sound that carried in the cold air. The American reaction was instantaneous. Grenades through windows, automatic weapons fire saturating the area, illumination by burning equipment. The German team withdrew, leaving 2 dead behind. Their mission failed by the kind of small accident that determines outcomes in close combat, where everything depends on who reacts first. Inside the Sherman tanks positioned around Hotton's perimeter, crews fought their own private battles against exhaustion and sensory deprivation. Tank warfare at night, without modern thermal sights, was an exercise in educated guessing. Commanders stood in their turrets because buttoning up meant blindness, but standing exposed meant vulnerability to snipers and artillery fragmentation. The sound of diesel engines idling masked the approach of infantry until they were literally touching the tank. Crews took turns sleeping, 1 man on watch while 4 rested, though rest in a metal box in freezing weather was relative. Sergeant Thomas Wade, commanding a Sherman in the northern sector, heard movement at 01:45 hours and traversed his turret based purely on sound, elevating slightly and firing a high explosive round into darkness at a target he could not see. The explosion illuminated a German half-track 50 meters away, and in that brief flash of light, Wade saw infantry dismounting, at least 20 men. He fired coaxial machine gun bursts at where the men had been, hearing screams that confirmed hits, and then darkness returned, and he had no way of knowing how many he had killed, or if survivors were now advancing toward his position with magnetic mines that could disable his tank before he knew they were there. The American aid station in Hotton operated throughout the night under conditions that violated every principle of battlefield medicine. Combat medics are supposed to work in covered positions with adequate light and supplies. Instead, they worked in a cellar with 2 lanterns that had to be shielded because light drew fire, treating wounds by feel as much as sight. Staff Sergeant James Fletcher, a conscientious objector from Pennsylvania who had volunteered as a medic because he would not carry a weapon but would serve his country, spent the night moving between wounded men and making decisions about who could wait and who needed immediate attention. The worst cases were burns from tank fires and artillery strikes, men whose faces were destroyed by flame, who screamed until morphine quieted them, who required treatment Fletcher could not provide with the supplies available. He worked with blood-soaked hands, talking softly to wounded soldiers who were 19 and 20 years old, and asking for their mothers in voices that cut through Fletcher's professional detachment and reminded him that war's abstractions were composed of individual suffering. The darkness also concealed moments of humanity that doctrine insisted could not exist between enemies. At 02:30 hours, in a shattered bakery that had become no man's land between German and American positions, soldiers from both sides stumbled into each other while seeking shelter from artillery fire. The encounter should have been lethal. Instead, there was a moment of mutual recognition. Exhausted men who had been trying to kill each other for hours, suddenly face to face in a space too confined for combat. Both sides armed, but neither side firing. They stared at each other for perhaps 5 seconds, long enough for someone to make the decision not to throw the first grenade, and then both groups withdrew in opposite directions without shots fired. One of the American soldiers, Private Daniel Cohn from Brooklyn, would remember that moment for the rest of his life as the night he did not kill someone and was not killed in return. And he would never be certain whether that represented courage or cowardice, or simply recognition that some moments in war are too human for killing. The fighting in Hotton streets during the overnight hours of December 21st to 22nd produced casualties that statistics would later reduce to numbers, but which represented individual tragedies of stunning brutality. Hand-to-hand combat in Cellars, where men fought with entrenching tools and rifle butts because quarters were too close for guns. Machine gun duels where American and German teams fired at muzzle flashes across streets 30 meters wide until one crew died and the other survived by pure chance. Grenade exchanges where explosions in confined spaces killed through overpressure as much as fragmentation. The dead and wounded accumulated in positions that could not be safely reached for evacuation, and both sides left soldiers where they fell because recovering bodies under fire was suicide. The overnight casualty rate exceeded anything Task Force Ourthe had experienced in the battle's first day. 47 Americans killed or wounded between 2200 hours, December 21st, and 0600 hours, December 22nd. A loss rate that would be unsustainable for more than another day or two. The German casualties were higher, estimated at over 110 killed and wounded, reflecting the tactical reality that attackers in urban terrain pay disproportionate costs. But German commanders had more men to spend, and the calculus of attrition favored the side with numerical superiority if they were willing to accept losses. Major Holtmeyer, receiving casualty reports throughout the night, made the calculations that all commanders make. How many men can I lose before unit cohesion collapses? The answer depended on too many variables to calculate precisely, but Holtmeyer understood that he was approaching the limit where his regiment would be combat ineffective, regardless of orders to continue attacking. German infantry companies that started the offensive with 120 men were down to 60 or 70. Platoons had become squads. Squads were led by corporals because sergeants were dead. The human infrastructure that makes armies function was being ground away in a battle for a town that most soldiers could not locate on a map before they were ordered to capture it. As 0415 hours approached, bringing the first hint of dawn that was still hours away, the intensity of combat began to diminish. Both sides had reached the limits of what exhausted men could sustain in darkness without rest or resupply. German forces withdrew to positions 500 meters from the town center, consolidating, preparing for renewed attacks in daylight. American defenders used the lull to redistribute ammunition, evacuate some wounded, and improve fighting positions that the night's combat had revealed as inadequate. Nobody slept because sleep required trust that the enemy would not attack during those vulnerable moments. And trust was a luxury neither side could afford. Soldiers cleaned weapons, checked equipment, ate cold rations, and waited for dawn with the knowledge that daylight would bring renewed combat, but at least they would be able to see what was trying to kill them. The sun rose on December 22nd at 0745 hours, revealing a battlefield transformed by 12 hours of darkness. Bodies lay in the streets, American and German both, frozen in the positions where they had fallen. Damaged vehicles smoldered, adding pillars of black smoke to the morning fog. Buildings that had stood intact yesterday were now collapsed ruins. The stone bridge, improbably, remained undamaged, its 19th century construction proving more durable than the 20th century structures surrounding it. American soldiers, emerging cautiously from fighting positions to assess the situation in daylight, saw for the first time the ground they had defended in darkness. A landscape of rubble and destruction that no longer resembled a town, but rather some medieval vision of hell rendered in shattered stone and frozen blood. And they understood, seeing the evidence of the night's fighting, that they had survived something extraordinary, but that survival was not victory, merely continuation. And the battle was far from over. The longest night had ended, but there would be other nights, and each would demand the same terrible calculation. Hold until dawn, then hold through the day, then hold through another night until reinforcements arrived or strength failed, or someone higher up decided that Hotton had cost enough and allowed withdrawal. The stone bridge stood behind them, intact and contested, a symbol of everything they were fighting for and everything they might yet lose. December 22nd, 1944, 0800 hours. Major Robert Orr walked the perimeter of his contracted defensive line with the mechanical deliberation of a man forcing himself to confront reality he would rather avoid. His 17 Sherman tanks had been reduced to 9 operational vehicles. Company B, 36th Armored Infantry, reported effective strength of 68 men from an original roster of 110. The tank destroyer platoon had been reduced to 3 functional M10s. His artillery support was intact but running low on ammunition, and resupply convoys were uncertain because German forces had interdicted several supply routes. Orr was a professional soldier, trained at West Point to analyze tactical situations objectively, but walking past wounded men and destroyed equipment forced him to confront the human cost of his decision to hold Hotton rather than withdraw. The question that gnawed at him was not whether his orders required him to hold, they did, but whether his decision to keep the bridge intact had condemned more men to death than necessary. The morning light revealed details that darkness had hidden. American dead lay where they had fallen, bodies frozen by overnight temperatures that reached -12 degrees Celsius. Some had been dragged to collection points, but many remained in exposed positions that could not be safely reached. The proper procedure, the one taught in manuals and expected by regulations, was to evacuate fallen soldiers for proper burial, but proper procedure assumed controlled situations, adequate personnel, and time to conduct operations according to doctrine. Hotton offered none of those conditions. Bodies would remain where they fell until tactical situation permitted recovery, which might be days or weeks. Soldiers fighting among their dead comrades absorbed lessons about war's reality that no training could teach, that death was commonplace rather than exceptional, that the dead served tactical purposes as much as the living by marking positions that had been contested, and that grief was a luxury postponed until after survival was assured. The Belgian civilians emerging from Cellars to assess damage faced their own calculations about cost and survival. Marie Bouillon climbed from her basement for the first time since December 20th to discover her house no longer existed above ground level. Walls were collapsed, the roof was gone, furniture was buried under rubble or burned in fires that had consumed the upper floor. She stood in what had been her kitchen and tried to calculate what could be salvaged, some blankets, a few cooking implements, photographs that had somehow survived. Her neighbors' houses were similarly destroyed or damaged beyond immediate repair. 23 bodies, civilian and military mixed, were visible in her street alone. The town she had lived in for 30 years, where she had been born and married and raised children, had been transformed into a battlefield, where the physical structures of normal life were casualties equal to the people who had inhabited them. The American situation report sent to Corps headquarters that morning contained the kind of sanitized language that translated human suffering into administrative categories. Task Force Ourthe reports 40% casualties, 9 tanks operational, defensive perimeter contracted to core town area, ammunition status yellow, morale adequate. Each phrase represented decisions about how to present bad news without triggering precipitous reactions from higher command. 40% casualties meant 1 soldier in 3 was dead or wounded, a loss rate that would render most units combat ineffective. 9 operational tanks from an original 17 meant armored strength was nearly halved. Yellow ammunition status meant supplies were adequate for 24 to 48 hours under current consumption rates, after which the task force would face crisis. Morale adequate was perhaps the most significant assessment, because it suggested soldiers were still willing to fight despite knowing the odds, and willingness to fight was often the difference between positions held and positions lost. Major General Matthew Ridgway, receiving these reports at 18th Airborne Corps headquarters, faced the commander's eternal dilemma: reinforce success or cut losses. Task Force Ourthe was holding, but barely, and the German offensive showed no signs of abating. Ridgway could commit reinforcements to Hotton, but those reinforcements would come from other sectors where they might be needed equally. He could authorize withdrawal, shortening his defensive line and preserving Task Force Ourthe as a viable unit, but withdrawal would surrender the bridge and potentially unhinge adjacent positions. The decision was complicated by incomplete information about German intentions. Were the attacks on Hotton the main effort or a diversion? Was German strength increasing, or had they committed their available forces? Ridgway, studying maps and casualty reports, made the decision that defined his command style: hold Hotton, send reinforcements, but recognized that tactical flexibility might require withdrawal if the situation deteriorated further. It was the kind of conditional decision that left everyone unsatisfied but preserved options. The German side faced parallel assessments with different conclusions. At 116th Panzer Division headquarters, staff officers compiled their own casualty reports and calculated that 2 days of fighting in Hotton had cost the division approximately 350 casualties, 15 tanks damaged or destroyed, and consumed ammunition and fuel at rates that could not be sustained. The division commander, receiving Major Holtmeyer's situation report, confronted the same question Ridgway faced: continue attacking or redeploy forces. The German decision was influenced by broader strategic considerations. Operation Wacht am Rhein was stalling across the entire front. American reinforcements were arriving faster than German intelligence had predicted. The weather was forecast to improve, which would allow American air superiority to become tactically decisive. Hotton represented one objective among dozens, and the resources being consumed there might be better employed elsewhere. The decision transmitted to Holtmeyer at 1500 hours December the 22nd reflected German strategic recalculation. Suspend offensive operations against Hotton. Consolidate positions on favorable ground east of the Ourthe. Await further orders. It was not withdrawal or admission of defeat, but recognition that tactical stalemate served neither side's interests. The German forces would remain in contact, maintain pressure on American positions, be prepared to exploit any American weakness. But the intensive attacks that had characterized December 20th through 22nd would cease, replaced by a defensive posture that conserved strength, while German high command determined where and how to continue the offensive. For the soldiers of Panzergrenadier Regiment 60, the order meant relief from suicidal assault missions, though it also meant acknowledging that 2 days of combat had achieved nothing except casualties. The afternoon of December 22nd brought the kind of combat that defined stalemate: sporadic exchanges of artillery and small arms fire, patrol activities on both sides seeking intelligence about enemy positions, isolated engagements where small units clashed briefly before disengaging. The intensity was lower than previous days, but the danger remained constant. Sergeant Michael Pina led a patrol that afternoon to investigate whether German forces had withdrawn from positions on Hotton's eastern edge. His squad moved cautiously through rubble-strewn streets, weapons ready, expecting ambush. They found abandoned German positions, foxholes, spent ammunition casings, bloodstains in the snow, but no living enemies. Pina reported the findings to company headquarters, and intelligence officers debated whether this indicated withdrawal or tactical repositioning. The truth, which neither side would know with certainty for another 24 hours, was that German forces had pulled back 500 meters, far enough to be less vulnerable to American artillery, but close enough to resume attacks if ordered. The civilian population, caught between military forces that had destroyed their town while fighting over it, began the process of assessing what survival meant when home no longer existed. Approximately 400 people remained in Hotton, sheltering in cellars or buildings that retained enough structure to provide minimal protection. They had no electricity, no running water, limited food supplies, and decreasing ability to keep warm as winter temperatures persisted. The American military government officers who arrived that afternoon to assess civilian needs found a population traumatized by 60 hours of continuous combat, angry at both sides for bringing war to their homes, and desperate for assurance that the fighting was over. The officers could provide medical supplies and promised food deliveries, but could not promise that combat would not resume. The civilians, listening to these qualified assurances, understood that they were hostages to a tactical situation over which they had no control and which might yet kill them, even if the soldiers claimed to be protecting them. The cost of holding Hotton through December 22nd was calculated in multiple ledgers, each measuring different forms of expenditure. American military casualties totaled 89 killed, 156 wounded, 12 missing. Equipment losses included 8 Sherman tanks destroyed, 5 more damaged, 3 M10 tank destroyers destroyed, 4 artillery pieces damaged by counter-battery fire, uncounted small arms and crew-served weapons lost with their operators. Ammunition consumption had exceeded 2,000 artillery rounds, 80,000 small arms rounds, and 140 anti-tank projectiles. German casualties, estimated from prisoner interrogations and battlefield counts, exceeded 400 killed and wounded, with armor losses comparable to American rates. The civilian toll was 17 confirmed dead, 43 wounded, 300 homeless, and an entire community's infrastructure destroyed or damaged beyond immediate repair. But there was another calculation, intangible and harder to measure, that commanders on both sides recognized as perhaps more significant than numbers. The Americans had held. Task Force Ourthe, assembled in hours from mismatched units, thrown into combat without preparation, had survived 2 days of German assault and retained control of the key terrain. The psychological impact of this defensive success would resonate beyond Hotton itself. American units elsewhere in the Ardennes, hearing that an improvised task force had stopped a German division, would approach their own defensive missions with greater confidence. German commanders, reporting that even secondary objectives required major combat operations to capture, would be forced to recalculate timelines and resource allocations across the entire front. Hotton would not be remembered the way Bastogne was remembered, would not appear in popular histories or Hollywood films. But in the immediate aftermath of December 22nd, 1944, it represented something that both sides understood even if they could not quantify. Proof that the American army was no longer the uncertain force that had stumbled through its first engagements 2 years earlier, but had become, through hard experience, an opponent capable of improvising effective defense under the worst possible conditions. The price of that proof was measured in burned homes and broken bodies, but the strategic value would become clear only as the Battle of the Bulge developed over the subsequent weeks, when American defensive stands at multiple points along the line collectively exhausted German offensive potential and transformed Hitler's last gamble into Germany's final defeat in the West. December 23rd, 1944. 600 hours. The soldiers of the 84th Infantry Division, officially designated the Rail Splitters after Abraham Lincoln's frontier heritage, had been moving through the frozen darkness for 6 hours when they first heard the distant sound of artillery fire that marked Hotton's location. These men were relative newcomers to combat, having arrived in France in early November and spent most of December in what the Army classified as orientation operations, limited patrols and defensive positions designed to acclimate fresh divisions to European combat before committing them to major engagements. Now they were being thrown into the Battle of the Bulge's northern sector with orders to relieve Task Force Ourthe and expand the Hotton defensive perimeter. Private Robert Marchetti, a machine gunner from Philadelphia who had celebrated his 20th birthday on the ship crossing the Atlantic, marched in column with his unit and tried to reconcile the abstract concept of combat he had trained for with the very concrete reality of explosions. He could hear growing louder with each kilometer. The 84th Infantry Division represented the American military's industrial approach to warfare, mass-produce competent formations, equip them adequately, train them sufficiently, and deploy them in numbers that overwhelmed opponents regardless of individual unit quality. The division numbered approximately 14,000 men at full strength, organized into 3 infantry regiments and supporting artillery, engineers, and service units. They were not elite troops, not paratroopers or rangers selected for special capabilities. They were ordinary Americans, draftees mostly, from cities and farms and small towns who had been transformed through basic training and unit preparation into soldiers who could execute standard infantry tactics with reasonable proficiency. What they lacked in experience, they compensated through firepower. The division's organic artillery consisted of 36 howitzers, 12 of them 155mm guns capable of demolishing hardened positions at ranges exceeding 15 kilometers. The lead elements of the 334th Infantry Regiment reached Hotton's northern outskirts at 8:30 hours, where they met representatives from Task Force Ourthe, who briefed them on the tactical situation. The scene that greeted the 84th Division soldiers shocked those who had not yet experienced intensive combat. The town was destroyed. Bodies, American and German both, lay frozen in streets and fields. Wounded men were being evacuated on stretchers through mud and snow. The soldiers of Task Force Ourthe looked like refugees from a medieval war, exhausted, hollow-eyed, uniforms filthy and torn, moving with the mechanical efficiency of men functioning on instinct, because conscious thought required energy they no longer possessed. Colonel Timothy Pedley, commanding the 334th Infantry, absorbed the scene with the understanding that his fresh troops would look like this within days if the tactical situation did not improve. The integration of the 84th Division into Hotton's defense began with a kind of coordination meeting that determined whether ad hoc command relationships functioned or collapsed into confusion. Major Ourthe, who had not slept more than 2 hours consecutively since December 20th, met with Colonel Pedley in a cellar command post and conducted a situation briefing that combined tactical assessment with brutal honesty. "The Germans have pulled back, but they're still out there," Ourthe explained, pointing to map positions. "My people are exhausted. We've lost 40% casualties. We're low on ammunition and lower on energy. I can hold for another day, maybe 2, but we need your people to take over sectors and give my men rest." Pedley, listening to this assessment, recognized that Ourthe was not asking for relief, but stating facts that would determine operational planning. The two officers worked out a phased integration. 84th Division units would occupy defensive sectors, allowing Task Force Ourthe elements to rotate to reserve positions for rest and resupply. The transformation in American capabilities that accompanied the 84th Division's arrival was not primarily about additional manpower, though that mattered, but about the restoration of combined arms coordination that Task Force Ourthe's casualties had degraded. The division brought its full artillery complement, properly organized and supported, with forward observers who could direct massed fire missions with the kind of precision that only well-trained teams achieved. They brought engineer companies with equipment for improving fighting positions, clearing obstacles, and constructing field fortifications. They brought anti-aircraft batteries that could defend against the Luftwaffe should German air assets appear, and they brought the psychological boost that comes from knowing reinforcements have arrived and you are no longer fighting alone. For Task Force Ourthe's survivors, seeing fresh troops deploy was the first indication since December 20th that someone at higher headquarters remembered they existed and considered their survival worth additional resources. The first coordinated counterattack, incorporating both Task Force Ourthe and 84th Division elements, was planned for 1400 hours, December 23rd, designed to push German forces further from Hotton and establish better defensive terrain. The American advantage had shifted dramatically with the arrival of divisional artillery, where Task Force Ourthe had fought with limited fire support. The combined American force could now call on 54 artillery pieces, 18 M2A1 105mm howitzers, 12 M1 155mm howitzers, and 6 M12 155mm gun motor carriages. This represented a weight of firepower that could saturate an area 1 kilometer square with high explosive shells in minutes. The planning reflected lessons learned from 2 days of defensive combat. Artillery would prepare the objective with rolling barrage. Infantry would advance behind the barrage in coordinated bounds. Tanks would provide direct fire support from overwatch positions, rather than leading the assault into potential anti-tank ambushes. The artillery preparation began at 1300 hours with target registration on German positions identified through patrol reports and aerial observation. For 30 minutes, American guns fired methodically at suspected German locations, adjusting based on observer corrections, walking shells through assembly areas and approach routes. The sound was continuous thunder, each gun firing at intervals calculated to maintain constant pressure on the target area. German counter-battery fire was limited and ineffective, confirming intelligence assessments that German artillery ammunition was nearly exhausted. At 1330 hours, the barrage shifted to a rolling pattern, explosions advancing at 50 meters per minute while infantry followed behind the wall of fire. This was combined arms doctrine as taught in manuals and practiced in training, and watching it executed with adequate resources demonstrated what American forces could accomplish when given proper support. The infantry assault that followed the artillery preparation encountered lighter resistance than expected, not because German forces had been annihilated, but because they had withdrawn from positions that were being systematically destroyed. German doctrine emphasized preservation of force over holding terrain, and German commanders understood that remaining in place under artillery bombardment that they could not suppress with counterfire was suicidal. By 1600 hours, American forces had advanced 1,200 meters east of Hotton, occupied the high ground that had been German observation positions, and established a new defensive line that pushed the battlefield away from the town itself. The advance was measured in hundreds of meters rather than kilometers, but it represented genuine tactical success. American forces expanding their perimeter, German forces conceding terrain, and momentum shifting in ways that both sides recognized, even if neither wanted to acknowledge openly. Private Robert Marchetti experienced his first combat during the December 23rd attack, and his recollections captured the confusion and terror that characterized infantry assault even when supported by overwhelming firepower. "The artillery made the ground shake like an earthquake," he wrote in a letter to his family weeks later. "We advanced in waves, 50 meters at a time, always expecting to be shot, but the Germans had mostly pulled back. I saw my first dead German soldier, just a kid really, lying in a foxhole with his rifle still in his hands. I kept thinking that could be me, lying there frozen, and someone from the German army walking past and seeing me the same way. We took the objective around 4 in the afternoon and dug in, expecting counterattack, but nothing came. My squad leader said we did good, but all I remember is being terrified the entire time and trying not to show it." The German perspective on December 23rd was captured in the report Major Holtmeyer transmitted to division headquarters that evening. American forces launched coordinated attack, supported by massed artillery. Regiment conducted fighting withdrawal to preserve personnel and equipment. New defensive positions established along high ground east of Ourthe River. Casualties moderate. Ammunition situation critical. Request resupply and clarification of division intentions regarding further operations in this sector. The report's professional language concealed Holtmeyer's private assessment, which he confided to his operations officer. "We are no longer attacking. We are trying not to collapse. The Americans have more artillery than we have ammunition to respond with, and they are learning how to use it. If this continues, we will be bled white without achieving any objective that matters strategically." The evening of December 23rd brought the first indication that weather patterns were shifting in ways that would fundamentally alter the battle. The heavy overcast that had protected German forces from Allied air power for the first week of the offensive was breaking up. Forecasters predicted clear skies within 24 hours, which meant American fighter bombers could resume ground attack missions. For German forces operating with limited fuel and exposed supply lines, this was catastrophic news. The Wehrmacht had learned in Normandy what Allied air supremacy meant: columns attacked on roads, supply vehicles destroyed before reaching combat units, movement forced into nighttime hours that complicated logistics. The Ardennes offensive had succeeded initially in part because weather grounded Allied aircraft. Once the skies cleared, the arithmetic of the campaign would shift decisively against Germany. As December 23rd ended, the tactical situation at Hotton had stabilized in favor of American forces. The town remained in American hands, the bridge was intact and defended. German forces had been pushed back to positions where they could no longer directly threaten the town center, and American strength had increased while German strength declined. This was not dramatic victory characterized by enemy routes and territorial gains measured in the tens of kilometers. It was the grinding, incremental success that characterized the American way of war in Europe: concentrate superior resources, apply systematic pressure, accept casualties as necessary costs, and gradually exhaust the enemy through attritional warfare that favored the side with greater industrial capacity. The soldiers who had held Hotton through December 20th through 22nd would receive credit for the defensive stand, but the 84th Infantry Division's arrival and the artillery support it brought were equally critical to transforming defensive success into operational advantage. Private Marchetti, trying to sleep in a frozen foxhole that night, did not understand the strategic significance of what had happened. He knew only that he had survived his first day of combat, that German soldiers died like everyone else when hit by bullets, and that war was simultaneously more mundane and more terrifying than anything training had prepared him to experience. The Lightning Division had arrived, and with it came the resources that would determine whether Hotton became a footnote in the Battle of the Bulge or remained the keystone that prevented German breakthrough in the northern sector. December the 23rd, 1944. 1900 hours. Field Marshal Walter Model sat in his Army Group B headquarters, a requisitioned estate 30 kilometers behind the front lines, and read situation reports that transformed strategic optimism into operational crisis. Model was 54 years old, a Prussian officer who had risen through military competence rather than political connections, known for his ability to stabilize deteriorating situations on the Eastern Front. Hitler had placed him in command of Army Group B specifically because Model had repeatedly demonstrated the capacity to achieve results with limited resources. But even Model's talents could not overcome the mathematical reality that December 23rd's reports revealed. Operation Wacht am Rhein was failing across nearly every axis of advance, and the failure at Hotton exemplified problems that were systemic rather than localized. The situation map on Model's wall told a story that no amount of optimistic interpretation could disguise. The 6th Panzer Army, which was supposed to be at the Meuse River by December 22nd, had penetrated barely 45 kilometers at its deepest point. Kampfgruppe Piper, the spearhead that should have been leading the drive to Antwerp, was surrounded and fighting for survival near La Glaise. The 5th Panzer Army in the center had made better progress, approaching Bastogne, but American forces were defending that town in strength and showed no signs of withdrawing. The 7th Army on the southern flank had failed entirely to shield the offensive's southern shoulder, allowing Patton's 3rd Army to pivot north and prepare counterattacks. Across the entire front, German forces were consuming fuel at rates that could not be sustained. Ammunition expenditure exceeded resupply capability, and casualties were mounting toward levels that would render divisions' combat ineffective within days. Hotton appeared on Model's situation map as one small notation among dozens, but its significance exceeded its size. The town controlled routes that German planners had designated as secondary, but which had become primary after northern routes failed. The 116th Panzer Division's inability to capture Hotton meant the 5th Panzer Army's northern wing could not expand, could not threaten American positions from the flank, could not open new avenues of advance when original routes were blocked. Model understood combined arms warfare, understood that modern offensives required multiple simultaneous thrusts because single-axis attacks could be contained by concentrated defense. Hotton's failure to fall represented one more avenue closed, one more option foreclosed, one more indication that American defensive capabilities were exceeding German offensive capacity. The telephone call with Adolf Hitler that evening exemplified the gap between strategic fantasy and tactical reality that characterized German command in late 1944. Hitler, speaking from his headquarters in East Prussia, demanded updates on the offensive's progress and reacted with fury to reports of stagnation. The 6th Panzer Army must reach the Meuse, Hitler insisted. Dietrich has the forces necessary. He must use them more aggressively. Model, listening to this assessment from a man who had not visited the front or spoken to division commanders in weeks, attempted to inject reality. My Führer, the offensive has stalled. American resistance is stronger than intelligence predicted. Our fuel situation is critical. Weather is improving, which will allow American air superiority to become decisive. We must consider, Hitler interrupted before Model could complete the sentence. There is no consideration except victory. Order renewed attacks across all sectors. The offensive must succeed. Model had commanded on the Eastern Front long enough to recognize impossible orders, and he had survived by finding ways to appear compliant while actually doing what tactical sense required. After the conversation with Hitler ended, Model summoned his chief of staff and issued orders that technically obeyed Hitler's directive while actually implementing a fighting withdrawal. All units will maintain pressure on American positions and exploit any opportunities for advance. However, units will not conduct attacks that risk destruction without corresponding strategic gain. Commanders are authorized to conduct tactical withdrawals to favorable positions when necessary to preserve combat effectiveness. These orders gave divisional commanders permission to retreat while maintaining the fiction of continued offense. the kind of careful language that allowed professional soldiers to survive serving a regime increasingly divorced from military reality. The specific order regarding Hotton reflected Model's recalculation of operational priorities. The 116th Panzer Division received authorization to disengage from unprofitable combat and assume defensive positions along terrain of tactical advantage. In practical terms, this meant abandoning attempts to capture Hotton and instead establishing a defensive line that could contest American counterattacks while conserving German strength. The order reached Major Holtmeyer at 0200 hours December 24th, and Holtmeyer's relief was evident in his acknowledgement. Understood. Will implement fighting withdrawal to prepared positions east of Ourthe River, commencing dawn December 24th. After 2 days of attacking against increasingly unfavorable odds, Holtmeyer's regiment would finally be allowed to stop bleeding itself against American defenses. The German withdrawal from Hotton on December 24th was not chaotic retreat, but professional disengagement conducted by soldiers who understood how to break contact without inviting disaster. Units pulled back in sequence, covering each other's movement with fire, demolishing bridges and cratering roads to slow American pursuit. Wounded were evacuated, functioning equipment was withdrawn, disabled vehicles were destroyed to prevent capture. By mid-morning, December 24th, German forces had established new positions approximately 3 kilometers east of Hotton, occupying the high ground overlooking the Ourthe River Valley, prepared to defend but no longer attempting to advance. The withdrawal was completed with minimal additional casualties, demonstrating that Wehrmacht tactical proficiency remained intact, even as strategic situation deteriorated. The broader strategic context that Model grasped more clearly than Hitler was that Operation Wacht am Rhein had already failed in its fundamental objective, even if local tactical situations remained contested. The offensive was supposed to split Allied armies, capture Antwerp, force negotiated settlement that would allow Germany to concentrate forces against the Soviet Union. These objectives required rapid advance, surprise, and Allied disorganization. By December 24th, surprise was long gone. Allied forces were responding with coordinated efficiency, and German advance had stalled everywhere short of objectives. The most optimistic assessment Model could make was that the offensive had delayed Allied operations and inflicted casualties, but these achievements fell far short of justifying the resources expended or the strategic risks accepted. The weather forecast for December 24th confirmed Model's worst concerns. Clear skies were predicted across the entire Ardennes region, the first sustained clear weather since the offensive began. This meant American and British aircraft could finally operate without restriction, and Allied air power was overwhelming. Model had experienced what happened when Allies achieved air supremacy. His forces in Normandy had been systematically destroyed by fighter bombers that attacked anything that moved during daylight. Roads became death traps. Supply columns were annihilated. Infantry positions were subjected to rocket and cannon fire, against which there was no defense except dispersion and concealment. The clearing weather meant German forces would now face the full weight of Allied air power while already exhausted, short of ammunition, critically low on fuel, and defending positions rather than advancing toward objectives. The evening of December 24th brought a meeting between Model and General Heinrich von Luttwitz, commander of the 47th Panzer Corps, which included the 5th Panzer Army units that had made the deepest penetrations. The two officers studied maps and discussed what professional soldiers discuss when their forces are failing: how to avoid encirclement, where to establish defensive lines, which units could be safely withdrawn versus which had to hold until others escaped. Von Luttwitz was blunt in his assessment. We achieved surprise and made gains, but we lack the fuel to continue advancing, and we lack the strength to hold what we have taken. American reinforcements are arriving faster than we are destroying American units. If we remain in the salient we have created, we risk being cut off and destroyed. If we withdraw now, we can save most of our forces for defensive operations. Model nodded, understanding that von Luttwitz was correct, but that suggesting withdrawal to Hitler was career-ending, or possibly life-ending. The question that haunted Model on the night of December 24th was whether Germany could have succeeded if circumstances had been different. If paper had captured fuel depots, he was promised but never found. If weather had remained bad for another week. If American response had been as slow as German intelligence predicted. If Hotton had fallen on December 21st as planned. Could Operation Wacht am Rhein have achieved breakthrough? Model, analyzing the campaign's failures, concluded that the answer was no, that the offensive had been predicated on assumptions about Allied capabilities that were fundamentally wrong, that Germany in December 1944 simply lacked the resources to defeat the combined industrial might of America and Britain, even with tactical surprise and favorable terrain. This conclusion was devastating because it meant the war was lost, that continued fighting was merely prolonging inevitable defeat, and that every soldier killed from this point forward was dying for nothing except postponing Germany's collapse. But Model was a professional soldier in a military system that prized obedience, serving a regime that executed officers who advocated surrender, and he would continue doing his duty even while understanding its futility. He drafted orders for December 25th that positioned Army Group B for defensive operations, consolidating positions, preparing fallback lines, organizing reserves for counterattacks against American penetrations. The orders did not use the word withdrawal because that word was forbidden, but every commander reading them would understand that the offensive phase had ended and survival phase had begun. The failure at Hotton was not unique or even particularly significant in isolation, but it represented the accumulated weight of dozens of similar failures across hundreds of kilometers of front, where German forces had attacked with everything they had and achieved less than they needed. Model, signing the orders that would transform Operation Wacht am Rhein from offensive to defense, understood that history would judge this campaign as Germany's last throw of the dice, and the dice had come up short. The question now was not whether Germany could win, but whether it could avoid complete destruction, and Model was not confident about the answer to that question either. December 24th, 1944, 0900 hours. Company K of the 334th Infantry Regiment began the methodical, dangerous work of clearing the forests northeast of Hotton, where intelligence reports indicated bypassed German forces remained in position. This was not the dramatic combat that newsreels showed, not tanks charging across open fields or infantry assaulting fortified positions. This was the grinding, intimate warfare of small units moving through dense terrain, checking every depression and thicket, knowing that sudden contact could erupt at ranges measured in meters. Lieutenant David Morrison, commanding Company K, had briefed his platoon leaders using terrain analysis and common sense rather than specific intelligence. The Germans withdrew, but not all of them made it out. Some are cut off, some are wounded, some are just lost in these woods. We're going to find them, neutralize them, and make sure our rear areas are secure. Move slow, stay spread out, and remember that a soldier who thinks he's surrounded and has nowhere to go will fight like a cornered animal. The Ardennes forests in December presented terrain that negated most of the technological advantages American forces enjoyed in open combat. Visibility was 20 to 30 meters at best, limited by dense undergrowth and trees that filtered even the weak winter sun. Artillery was useless because you could not see targets, and firing into woods at map coordinates was as likely to hit your own forces as enemy positions. Armor could not maneuver through trees, and tanks that tried to follow forest trails became predictable targets for ambush. Radio communication was degraded by terrain and vegetation. The combat devolved to infantry fundamentals, small unit tactics, individual weapon proficiency, physical courage, and the kind of situational awareness that distinguished veterans from soldiers who had not yet learned to read terrain and sense danger before seeing it. Company K was learning these lessons in real time, taught by encounters that left no room for mistakes. The terrain was not merely difficult, but actively hostile to human presence. The ground was deeply ravined, with sharp elevation changes that exhausted men carrying 50 pounds of equipment. Snow accumulation in sheltered areas reached 30 centimeters, making movement slow and loud. Frozen ground made digging impossible, so fighting positions were hasty arrangements of fallen logs and natural depressions. Temperatures remained below -10 degrees Celsius. cold enough that weapons malfunctioned, if not constantly maintained, cold enough that wounded soldiers could die from exposure before medics reached them. The Americans advancing through these conditions were not elite mountain troops trained for winter warfare, but ordinary infantry who were discovering that terrain killed as effectively as enemy fire. The first contact came at 10:30 hours when the lead squad of Company K's 1st Platoon stumbled into a German position that neither side had seen until they were 15 meters apart. The Germans, approximately 8 men occupying a small ravine, had the advantage of concealment and preparation. The Americans had the advantage of numbers and support from adjacent squads. The firefight lasted less than 2 minutes. Initial exchange of rifle and submachine gun fire, American squad leader calling for support. Flanking fire from 2nd Squad, catching Germans in crossfire. Sudden silence except for moans from wounded. When Company K secured the position, they found 5 German dead, 3 wounded, and none who had escaped. The German soldiers were young, most not yet 20 years old, from a Volksgrenadier division that had been committed to the offensive with minimal training. They had been bypassed during the German withdrawal and had been sitting in this ravine for 36 hours without food or orders, hoping either to be rescued or to surrender to Americans who would feed them and send them to prisoner camps where survival was certain rather than probable. The pattern repeated throughout the day. Brief, violent contacts at close range, followed by German surrender or German death, rarely any middle ground. At 12:15 hours, 2nd Platoon engaged a German machine gun team that had set up an ambush position overlooking a trail. The Germans killed 2 Americans before rifle grenades suppressed the position. At 1400 hours, a German sniper fired from a concealed position in a tree, wounding an American sergeant before being killed by concentrated return fire that shredded the tree and the sniper, both. At 1620 hours, a larger group of approximately 20 Germans attempted to break out of encirclement, running downslope toward American lines with weapons firing, and were cut down by defensive fire that demonstrated the firepower advantage American infantry enjoyed. M1 Garand rifles firing as fast as men could pull triggers, Browning automatic rifles putting out sustained fire, and light machine guns that turned retreat routes into killing zones. But the most psychologically difficult encounters were those without combat, where American patrols found German soldiers who had already died from exposure or wounds sustained in earlier fighting. At 13:30 hours, Company K discovered a German aid station in a small cave, abandoned by medics who had fled during the withdrawal, but still containing 32 wounded German soldiers too badly hurt to move. The Americans called for medics and prisoners of war handlers, and Staff Sergeant James Fletcher, the conscientious objector who had spent December 21st treating American wounded under fire, now found himself treating enemy soldiers with the same dedication he brought to caring for his own side. They were just kids, Fletcher wrote in his diary that night. 18, 19 years old. Some of them had been lying there for 2 days without food or medical care. One kid grabbed my hand and said "Danke" over and over, thanking me for helping him, even though I was the enemy. I don't know how to reconcile that. We're shooting at each other in the morning, and then I'm holding some German kid's hand while he dies in the afternoon. This war makes no sense except that it has to be won, and we're the ones who have to win it. Christmas Day, December 25th, brought no pause in clearing operations despite the calendar's significance. Company K resumed advance at 0800 hours, moving through sectors that had been German rear areas during the offensive and now were simply empty woods containing equipment abandoned during withdrawal. The soldiers found supply caches, ammunition dumps, communication wire, all the logistics infrastructure that armies require, but which become worthless when the tactical situation collapses. They found letters from German soldiers to families, photographs of wives and children, personal items that transformed enemy abstractions into humans with lives and loves and fears identical to their own. Private Daniel Cohn, who had survived the moment in the bakery cellar, where he chose not to kill Germans who chose not to kill him, found a German soldier's diary and had it translated by a company clerk who spoke German. The final entry, dated December 23rd, read, "We are withdrawing. I do not know where we are going or what happens next. I am very tired and want only to see my family again. This offensive was supposed to win the war, but I think we are only dying for nothing." Cohn, reading this translation, felt recognition that disturbed him because he had written nearly identical words in his own letters home. The final German pocket in the Hotton sector was eliminated on December 26th at 1600 hours when a group of 12 German soldiers, surrounded in a small farmhouse, surrendered after 48 hours without food or ammunition. They emerged with hands raised, calling "Kamerad" in the Universal Soldiers' appeal for mercy, and American infantry secured them without further violence. The prisoners were young, exhausted, frostbitten, and relieved to be captured. One German corporal spoke English well enough to serve as translator, and he told his captors, "We knew the offensive had failed days ago. We were waiting for orders that never came. When we heard you surrounding the house, we decided surrendering to Americans was better than freezing to death in a Belgian forest." His assessment captured what frontline soldiers on both sides understood, even when higher commanders denied it. The offensive was over, Germany had lost, and continued fighting was simply determining how many more would die before the inevitable conclusion. The clearing operations around Hotton cost Company K 14 killed and 28 wounded over 3 days of combat in terrain that favored neither side equally but rewarded caution and punished aggression. They eliminated approximately 400 bypassed German soldiers through combinations of combat, capture, and discovery of those already dead from wounds or exposure. The tactical result was secure American rear areas, removal of threat to supply lines, and psychological confidence that came from offensive action after days of defensive fighting. But the operational significance was limited, because these German forces had already been rendered combat ineffective by being cut off from command and resupply. Company K was not defeating a coherent enemy force, but rather cleaning up the human wreckage left by operational collapse. Lieutenant Morrison, compiling his after-action report on December 27th, tried to capture lessons learned from 3 days of forest combat. Fighting in dense woods is primarily about small unit leadership and individual soldier discipline. Artillery and air support are nearly useless. Armor cannot operate. Success depends on squad leaders who can read terrain, soldiers who can maintain weapons in extreme cold, and patience to clear terrain methodically rather than rushing into ambushes. Casualties are inevitable, but can be minimized by slow, thorough advances with adequate flank security. The psychological stress on soldiers is significant because contact comes suddenly at close range, leaving no time for fear before action is required. His assessment would be filed with hundreds of similar reports from dozens of units, contributing to the institutional knowledge that armies accumulate through experience measured in lives spent learning what works and what kills people. The human cost of clearing the woods was captured not in the official casualty statistics, but in the personal impacts on soldiers who survived. Private Robert Marchetti, the machine gunner who had experienced his first combat on December 23rd, spent 3 days in the forests learning that war was mostly cold and fear and exhaustion, punctuated by moments of terror. He would return home in 1945, work in a factory in Philadelphia, raise a family, and never speak about these days to anyone except other veterans who had their own woods and their own dead to remember. Sergeant Michael Pina, the Mexican-American from Texas who had commanded strangers thrown together in Task Force Orr, was killed on January 8, 1945, during the pursuit beyond Hotton, shot by a German rearguard he never saw. His body was recovered and buried in Henri Chapelle American Cemetery, Plot 1, Row 11, Grave 347, one white cross among thousands. The forests northeast of Hotton were eventually cleared, declared secure, and forgotten by everyone except the men who had fought there and the families who received telegrams informing them that their sons or husbands had died in a place they could not locate on any map they owned. December 27, 1944, 0700 hours. The American pursuit beyond Hotton began with reconnaissance patrols advancing cautiously toward positions German forces had occupied before withdrawing. Captain James Mitchell, commanding Company A of the 33rd Armored Regiment, led a mixed force of 4 Sherman tanks and a platoon of infantry down the road toward Hamptoe, 8 kilometers east of Hotton, expecting contact, but uncertain when or where it would develop. The pursuit phase of operations was doctrinally simple: maintain pressure on retreating enemy, prevent them from establishing new defensive lines, exploit disorganization to achieve breakthrough. Reality, as soldiers learned repeatedly, was that pursuing a professional army, conducting fighting withdrawal, was dangerous work that produced casualties without corresponding territorial gains, when the enemy knew how to use terrain and delay tactics effectively. The German withdrawal demonstrated skills developed over years of defensive operations on the Eastern Front, where Wehrmacht forces had repeatedly conducted strategic retreats while maintaining tactical cohesion. Bridges were demolished as German rearguards withdrew across them, denying American armor the ability to advance quickly along roads. Road craters were blown at key choke points, forcing American engineers to spend hours filling holes or constructing bypasses. Minefields were laid on likely approach routes, not in sufficient density to stop American advance, but enough to force caution and delay. Most effectively, German rearguards occupied strong defensive positions and fought long enough to inflict casualties before withdrawing to subsequent positions, a leapfrogging defense that traded space for time while preserving forces. This was not the dramatic collapse of a defeated army, but the professional retreat of a military that remained dangerous even in withdrawal. The first American contact with German delaying forces came at 9:30 hours when Captain Mitchell's column reached a blown bridge 2 kilometers east of Hotton. The bridge had been expertly demolished, main support beams destroyed, so that reconstruction would require days rather than hours. As American engineers approached to assess the damage, German artillery fire landed with impressive accuracy, forcing everyone to cover and demonstrating that German forward observers were still active, and communication with artillery batteries remained functional. Mitchell called for counter-battery fire, and within minutes, American artillery was engaging suspected German gun positions based on trajectory analysis. The duel lasted 20 minutes before German guns fell silent, either displaced or destroyed. American engineers began work on a bypass while Mitchell's tanks established overwatch positions, waiting for infantry to clear woods that might conceal German anti-tank teams. The advance toward Hampton consumed the entire day of December 27th, 8 kilometers covered in 12 hours of cautious movement and brief engagements. German rearguards fought from prepared positions, usually a reinforced squad with a machine gun and Panzerfaust anti-tank weapons, positioned to cover approaches and inflict casualties before withdrawing. American forces responded with standard tactics: suppress with artillery and tank fire, flank with infantry, assault when resistance broke. The pattern repeated every few kilometers: contact, deployment, engagement, German withdrawal to next position. By nightfall, American forces had reached Hampton's outskirts but had not entered the town, uncertain whether it was defended or had been evacuated. Mitchell consolidated positions and requested instructions from higher headquarters, receiving orders to hold and await reinforcement before attempting to seize Hampton. December 28th brought heavy snow that complicated operations and favored the defense over pursuit. Visibility dropped to 100 meters in blowing snow, making observation impossible and artillery support ineffective because forward observers could not see targets. German forces used the weather to good advantage, reinforcing defensive positions around Hampton with additional troops withdrawn from other sectors, transforming what had been a rearguard position into a defended town that would require coordinated assault to capture. American commanders, receiving reconnaissance reports about German strength, made the calculated decision to pause the pursuit rather than force combat in conditions that favored defenders. This was not cowardice, but operational prudence, accepting that weather and terrain temporarily negated American advantages, and that resuming offensive operations when conditions improved made more sense than attacking now and accepting higher casualties. The German delaying action at Hampton on December 28th demonstrated why Wehrmacht forces remained formidable even in retreat. Approximately 200 German soldiers with 4 tanks occupied positions in and around the town, utilizing stone buildings as strong points and positioning anti-tank weapons to cover all approaches. When American forces probed defenses that afternoon, they encountered organized resistance, coordinated machine gun fire from multiple positions, mortar fire that landed on American assembly areas with accuracy suggesting professional forward observers, and tank fire from concealed positions that forced American armor to withdraw. The engagement lasted 6 hours, cost the Americans 8 killed and 19 wounded, and ended with German forces conducting another withdrawal under cover of darkness. American forces entered Hampton the morning of December 29th to find it empty except for booby traps and documents deliberately left to mislead intelligence analysts about German intentions. The pursuit operations through late December and early January revealed the mathematical reality that determined the Battle of the Bulge's outcome. German forces could delay American advance but could not stop it. American forces could advance but could not force decisive engagement against an enemy willing to trade terrain for time. The result was a slow, grinding restoration of the front lines to approximately where they had been before the offensive began. By January 2, 1945, American reconnaissance patrols were reaching positions they had occupied on December 15th, encountering German defenses that were now oriented toward preventing American penetrations into Germany rather than supporting continued offensive operations in Belgium. The strategic situation had been transformed. Instead of Germany attacking to split Allied armies, Germany was defending to prevent collapse of the Westwall defenses. The casualty statistics from the pursuit phase illustrated the costs of maintaining pressure on a retreating enemy. American forces in the Hotton sector suffered approximately 150 killed and wounded between December 27th and January 3rd, relatively light compared to the intensive combat of December 20th through 22nd, but still representing lives lost for territorial gains measured in kilometers that would be contested again in subsequent operations. German casualties were estimated higher, perhaps 300 to 400 killed and wounded. But these estimates were uncertain because German forces evacuated their wounded and recovered most of their dead, making accurate body counts impossible. What was certain was that both sides were exhausted, that units on both sides needed rest and reconstitution, and that continued operations were producing diminishing returns as soldiers approached the limits of what human endurance could sustain. The weather during late December and early January added another dimension of suffering to operations. Temperatures remained below freezing continuously, dropping to minus 15 Celsius on some nights. Soldiers on both sides suffered from frostbite, trench foot, and exposure injuries that removed men from combat as effectively as enemy fire. Hot food was rare, usually cold rations eaten in foxholes because gathering for hot meals drew artillery fire. Sleep was taken in shifts, never more than a few hours, always wearing boots and equipment, because contact could develop at any moment. Personal hygiene became impossible, and soldiers went weeks without bathing or changing clothes. The physical deterioration was accompanied by psychological exhaustion, the kind of weariness that made men careless because they no longer cared whether caution kept them alive or risk killed them quickly. January 4th, 1945, brought orders that American forces in the Hotton sector would suspend offensive operations and assume defensive positions while other units continued pursuing German forces in adjacent sectors. The decision reflected operational priorities determined at corps and army level. Resources were finite, some sectors were more important than others, and Hotton had achieved its purpose as a position that prevented German breakthrough. The soldiers who had fought for and around Hotton for 2 weeks received this news with mixed emotions. Relief that the immediate danger had passed. Frustration that their sacrifice had not been rewarded with dramatic victory. Recognition that they were alive when many of their friends were not. Uncertainty about what came next because the war was obviously not over, and they would be committed to new battles in new places with new casualties to come. The final accounting of the pursuit phase added approximately 300 American casualties and an estimated 500 German casualties to the battle's toll, bringing total losses in the Hotton sector to over 1,500 American and 2,500 German killed, wounded, and missing. These numbers were abstractions to staff officers compiling statistics, but represented individual human beings to the families who received telegrams and the units that mourned their dead. Private Daniel Cohn, the soldier from Brooklyn who had not killed Germans in the bakery and been spared in return, survived the pursuit and would survive the war, returning home in October 1945 to work in his father's shop and try to forget faces he could not forget. Captain James Mitchell, who had commanded Company A's tanks through the entire Hotton battle, was transferred to a staff position after superiors decided he had earned rest from frontline command. He protested the transfer, arguing his men needed him. But orders were orders, and he spent the war's final months at division headquarters feeling guilty about surviving when subordinates continued dying. The pursuit to the original lines completed the Battle of Hotton's tactical cycle: defense, counterattack, pursuit, consolidation. The stone bridge still stood, intact and functional, a monument to Major Orr's decision to defend rather than destroy. The town itself was largely destroyed, its buildings reduced to rubble that would take years to clear and rebuild. The civilian population was scattered, some still sheltering in cellars, others evacuated to rear areas, all traumatized by witnessing their home become a battlefield. The military outcome was clear. American forces had held, German offensive had failed, front lines were being restored to status quo antebellum. But the human cost could not be calculated in purely military terms, because wars are fought by people who carry the experience with them long after peace is declared, and the veterans of Hotton would carry memories that define their lives in ways that no official history could capture or commemorate adequately. The pursuit was over. The battle was over. But for those who had fought it, Hotton would never be over, would remain a permanent part of their personal histories. And the stone bridge they had defended would stand as physical reminder of sacrifice that the world would largely forget, while the survivors remembered until their last days.